A quick like and subscribe really helps our channel grow and allows us to bring you even more amazing content. Thank you for your support.
I never considered myself a selfish person, but that all changed the night I found myself face to face with the thing I had cooked, something so ordinary yet so deeply unsettling, and how it pushed me to the brink of sanity. My parents worked long hours, leaving my younger siblings, Ryan, who was 9, and Lily, just 7, under my care, and on that fateful evening, I had taken a rare opportunity to experiment in the kitchen, something they usually encouraged but rarely had time for. I decided to whip up a batch of spaghetti and meatballs, a family classic that I thought they'd devour. The aroma wafted through the house, curling along the walls and wrapping around the corners, promising warmth and satisfaction. But the moment I called them to the table, their faces shifted from curiosity to disgust faster than I could blink. Ryan wrinkled his nose, pushing the plate away, while Lily, in her innocent defiance, declared she'd rather starve. I felt a wave of embarrassment flood my cheeks. After all the effort, after all the chopping and stirring, all I received were pouts and tantrums from two kids who would have preferred a cold slice of pizza or, even worse, the remnants of the last week's takeout. I tried reasoning with them, explaining how cooking was hard work, that I put my heart into this dish, but they seemed impervious to my pleas, their whining crescendoing until I felt as if my skin was crawling with irritation. Finally, I snapped, "Fine, if you don't want to eat it, don't. I won't cook you a second meal." The silence that followed was suffocating, but their half-hearted whimpers melted into fake sobs as they pushed their chairs back and skulked away, leaving me to simmer in my frustration alone. I thought they'd go to bed hungry, perhaps even learn a lesson about appreciation. Instead, it seemed I was the one cast as the villain in a twisted fairy tale. After an hour of silence thick enough to cut through, filled with the dread of impending accusations from my parents, I heard a series of soft, rhythmic thuds outside the kitchen window. I approached cautiously, peering out into the darkening yard, feeling an unsettling chill envelop me. To my disbelief, I noticed two distinct shapes just beyond the glow of the streetlight, Ryan and Lily, not playing but standing still, their backs towards me. They wore their usual pajamas, but something was off, their postures rigid like puppets with tangled strings. "What are you two doing out there?" I called, but they didn't respond, they just stood there, unmoving. A cold fear crept into my stomach. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but the screen flickered, the sudden loss of battery rendering me helpless. I decided I'd had enough of this strange tableau and stepped outside, my heart pounding in my ears as I approached, calling their names again. As I got closer, the silhouette of my siblings twisted into something grotesque, their limbs began to twitch unnaturally, and before I could process it, they turned their heads in unison, their faces contorted into wide, eerie grins that seemed impossible for anyone who wasn't completely lost in madness. "We're not hungry anymore," they screeched in a voice that was neither of them, a chorus of distorted laughter exploding into the stillness of the night. My breath caught in my throat, a primal urge to run surged through me, but I was rooted in place, entranced by this horror unfolding before me. I backed away, but as I turned, I tripped, hitting the ground hard. The laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a whisper so soft I almost didn't catch it. "You said we should learn a lesson." I shot back to my feet and sprinted inside, slamming the door behind me, locking it with trembling hands. I tried to convince myself it was just a fever dream, that my imagination was running wild due to their refusal to eat, but in the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow glide past the window, pacing back and forth as I huddled in a corner like a child afraid of the dark. The incessant tapping began again, this time accompanied by urgent whispers that clawed at my consciousness, a language I couldn't decipher but felt deeply lodged in my psyche. I grabbed a heavy kitchen knife, adrenaline coursing as I envisioned defending myself against whatever malevolence had taken hold of my siblings. I screamed their names, but all I got in response was a cacophony that churned in my gut, mocking my distress. As the night dragged on, their laughter echoed in the surrounding darkness, a nightmarish lullaby I couldn't escape. I dared to peek outside, and my heart shattered at the fantasy. They were gone, replaced by an abyss that seemed to yawn before me. Hours passed in a daze, and when dawn finally broke, I curled into a ball on the couch, racked with guilt and dread, unsure if I would face a paranormal nightmare or the wrath of my parents. The light spilled through the window, illuminating the room in a ghostly orange hue. When I summoned the courage to look outside, the yard was empty, devoid of my siblings, free of the twisted realities that had grappled me in the night. They appeared eventually, nonchalant as ever, the peculiar grins faded like the terrors of a waking dream. I didn't mention last night's episode. After all, who would believe me? My parents returned, and everything settled back into the repetitive rhythm of the household, yet a cold thread of tension weaved itself through our lives, quiet moments punctuated by lingering glances and echoes of that laughter, my siblings seemingly unaware of the change in their demeanor, but I recognized the flicker of something darker beneath their innocent facade. Days turned into weeks, and the dread only thickened. I started finding leftovers of food I hadn't made, twisted shapes of Play-Doh like meat, unrecognizable but oddly reminiscent of what I had cooked, lurking in dark corners. I attempted to make my case known, but it sounded ludicrous, and so I buried the fear beneath daily routines, buried it until it became a constant presence, a reminder of one fateful night when I had refused to nurture. I shivered, often dreaming of the dark laughter that would not let me sleep, forever chained to the guilt that grew like a weed. And one night, when the winds whispered through the cracks of our home, I dared to lay my head in resigned silence, but was pulled back into that heavy absence, my siblings out once more, standing like specters beneath the streetlights, faces illuminated in a sickly hue, as if a portal had cracked open between realms, and I was forced to face a harbinger of dread, knowing that somewhere inside I had sealed our fates the day I decided to abandon the very essence of what it meant to share a meal. As I gazed upon their twisted forms, I desperately wished to retract my words, to cook them anything they wanted, though I feared the cost would be far more than a second dinner, and the shadows hinted that the lesson had only just begun to unravel. I've always tried to be a good parent, or at least, that's what I tell myself when the guilt creeps in, especially after the argument with my son, Noah, last weekend. It started innocently enough. We were hosting a family barbecue, the kind that used to be full of laughter and joy, but things changed when his cousin, Mia, came over. Mia, with her bright smile, effortless charm, and an ease with people that Noah has never quite managed to grasp, was a whirlwind of energy as she sauntered into our yard after a long drive from the city. Noah, my 10-year-old introvert, sat rigidly at the corner of our deck, poking at his plate of burgers like they had personally offended him. When Mia launched herself at her younger sister, Chloe, squealing with delight and engaging her with an uninhibited joy that only kids should possess, I couldn't help but notice Noah's sulking expression grow darker. The longer he watched Mia laugh and play, the more withdrawn he became. It was as if every giggle was a dagger buried deeper into his heart, and the way my daughter fawned over Mia cut like shards of broken glass. I couldn't ignore it. When the barbecue came to a close, and I noticed Mia stuffing her face with cake while Noah stared blankly into his soda, I felt a pang of frustration bubbling up within me, a vile mix of heartbreak and anger that begged to be unleashed. So, I did what I shouldn't have. I confronted him. "You know, it's your fault she's happier to see Mia than she is to see you," I blurted out, the words laced with a sting I instantly regretted. Noah's face fell, his eyes wide with a combination of hurt and confusion, like a kid who'd just been told there's no Santa. He looked at me with a depth of sadness I had never seen before, and in that moment, I realized I had crossed a line, but it was too late to take it back. I watched him wilt under the weight of my words, and my heart twisted painfully as I heard Mia exclaim how much she missed Chloe, how they should have playdates all summer long, as Noah quietly snuck away from the group, headed inside like a ghost. The rest of the day was a haze. Laughter echoed outside while I stared at my untouched food as guilt coiled around my insides. It felt like the summer buzz had died with my son's spirit, and I couldn't bear to face the implications of what I had done. I watched Noah pace the floor of our living room, his brows knitted in concentration as if he were solving an unsolvable puzzle. I knew I'd hurt him but couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, my harsh words were a push he needed to confront his own struggles with social interactions. Parenting is a turbulent sea. Sometimes, you have to risk capsizing in order to teach your child how to swim. But that little thought didn't diminish the weight pressing down on me, a hand squeezing painfully around my heart while I tried justifying my big mouth. I spent the night tossing and turning, his shocked face replaying in my mind, a haunting echo of regret that morphed into nightmares filled with shadows whispering secrets of my failures. By morning, I decided I needed to talk to him, get his side of the story, and construct a bridge over this chasm I had opened with careless words. I found him in his room, so small and fragile in the dim, gray sunlight filtering through his window. When I sat beside him, he looked up, eyes stormy with a mixture of sorrow and anger. I wanted to reach out and pull him into my embrace, but something kept me rooted in place, the ghost of my previous words acting as a barrier. "Mom, why did you say that?" he asked, his voice steady but breaking at the edges. I fumbled for the right words but found none. "I didn't mean, I just wanted you to see." but stopped, trailing off, feeling the futility of my attempts. "Are you mad at me?" he said, and that broke me. I felt the hot rush of tears stinging my eyes as I wrestled with an instinct to just sweep him up and yell at him to express himself, let anger out into the ether rather than bottle it up like he always does. Noah was my delicate boy, always so kind but often mocked at school for being too soft. How could I say anything, be anything, when all I wanted was to shelter him from the world? "You're not to blame for anything, Mia is just more outgoing, and it shouldn't matter," I replied weakly, desperately clawing for some reassurance in my own voice while he stared at me, waiting for real honesty. I wanted to tell him that I was scared of his loneliness, scared that he wouldn't fit into the world the way I hoped for him, that every snide remark from his peers killed a piece of my heart. "You know what, Mom? I just want to be me," came those fragile words, breaking through the air, and in that moment, I realized how wrong I had been. As he turned away and stared out the window, I was reminded of crisp autumn days, golden leaves spiraling silently to the earth, and suddenly I felt the weight of my own expectations crashing down like thunder. I'd wanted my son to be someone he's not. The thought lingered long after he left to find solace in his video games, an echo of realization that resonated deep within me. It wasn't Noah who needed to change, it was me that needed to stop placing blame and start nurturing the incredible person he was destined to become. I knew I had to repair the rift I had caused, but how? Days passed, and I crafted a plan, an emotional lifeline, something to counter the agony of that summer gathering. I realized that he needed not just an apology but a show of faith in his individuality. A camping trip, just the two of us, away from the chaos, was something he could take pride in. So I took him one Saturday, packed the car with sleeping bags and junk food, and we left our technology behind, just the two of us, under the vast canopy of stars. I watched as Noah pitched the tent, his confidence growing little by little with each step he took, and I felt something shift in the air. The weight of guilt was still there but backed by hope too. As we sat around the campfire, with the crackling flames dancing in our eyes, I told him everything, how proud I was of him, how much his uniqueness meant to me, how I should have encouraged him to be himself rather than lash out in frustration. His grin lit up the night, warming the chill away like the flames before us, and in that magic moment, I saw a spark of resilience flicker in his soul. I realized something immensely powerful. By letting him feel just a bit of the weight of the world, he took the first step towards overcoming it. A few weeks later, things had transformed slightly. Noah laughed louder, started to engage with new friends from school, and I couldn't help but feel a deep sense of relief. It was as if my awful comments had forced a metamorphosis instead of breaking him, and as I watched him go through that new cycle of life, I knew I'd been wrong but that sometimes wrong turns can lead to unexpected growth. The barbecue wasn't the last. Family gatherings still echoed laughter just like that day did, but now I watched my son thrive instead of falter, and the cycle of hurt had turned into a cycle of healing, teaching him the resilience of the human spirit and that no matter what happens, coming back stronger is what truly matters. Amidst all that drama, amidst those blurted words and tearful evenings, there had emerged a tender understanding that formed deeper than any barrier, and while I may have blamed Noah, I realized it was just the gentle nudges of parenthood that pushed us both to be better versions of ourselves. In hauntingly beautiful ways, sometimes insensitivity can lead us to the love we really need. Last year, when my wife and I were expecting our daughter, we picked a beautiful name, Lila. It was a name that flowed like a gentle breeze, filled with warmth and kindness. Yet, shortly after her birth, something terrifying happened that turned our lives inside out and left me questioning my own sanity. It was a typical night. Lila had just been put down, and the house was quiet, the kind of quiet that wraps around you and feels almost sacred. That's when I heard it, a soft whispering coming from the nursery. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or perhaps the creaks of an old house settling into the chilling night. But as I listened more closely, I distinctly heard someone call her name, Lila. I froze, my blood turning to ice. I quietly crept to the door and peered through the small crack. There was no one in there, just the crib, the soft mobile spinning lazily above, and Lila, sleeping soundly, blissfully unaware of the sinister shadow that had seeped into our home. Thankfully, she was fine, but I couldn't shake the feeling of unease, like we'd crossed into a realm we weren't supposed to. Over the next few weeks, the haunting whispers continued, and weird things began happening. Once, I swear I saw the outline of a child's handprint on the nursery window, even though I hadn't let anyone near the house. Every time I brought it up to my wife, she shrugged it off as postpartum nerves, urging me to seek help. But it wasn't my sanity that I questioned, these were real manifestations, something darker than our mundane life. It got even stranger when one night, I awoke to Lila's cries echoing through the house. Rushing into the room, I found her wide-eyed, fixated on the corner of the room, her tiny finger pointed at something invisible. I panicked and scooped her up, trembling as I felt the weight of whatever unseen presence loomed near us. I knew I had to do something. I became obsessed, scouring the internet for anything that could explain this phenomenon. That's when I stumbled upon countless forums, each filled with heart-wrenching stories of children who seemed to have a connection to the ethereal realm, many accompanied by bizarre, folklore-inspired names. Suddenly, it all clicked. The name Lila derived from ancient roots and was tied to an old lore I could scarcely comprehend, a name said to call forth spirits from beyond, suggesting that perhaps my daughter was more than just my little girl, she could be a vessel for something unfathomable. With each ghostly whisper that echoed through the walls, the urgency of change became palpable. I approached my wife with what I'd learned, fearful and desperate. I suggested we consider changing Lila's name, perhaps to something less steeped in mystery and darkness, something that could sever any ties to the unsettling occurrences that now surrounded her. But she was vehemently opposed, her heart set on the name that laced our daughter's identity with beauty. "You can't just change it because you're scared of shadows," she yelled, her voice laced with anger and disbelief. "What kind of parent would do that? You're being irrational." In that moment, a chasm formed between us, split by fear and misunderstanding. Our relationship began to unravel, arguing over what felt like life or death to me became the new normal, my wife seeing me not as a caring father but as a paranoid lunatic. And then the horrors escalated. One evening, as I sat watching a movie with the sound turned low, I became acutely aware of Lila's cries rising like a siren in the night. I moved instinctively, racing to her room and coming to an abrupt stop at the threshold. The room was cast in shadows, but I swear I saw a figure hovering at Lila's crib, its dark form shrouded in an unsettling aura. I bolted forward, the adrenaline sending my heart into a frenzy, but as I grasped Lila in my arms, the figure dissipated, leaving nothing but the haunting feeling of being watched, as if time slowed and reality warped around me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I was convinced that Lila was in danger, and if I didn't act soon, something irreparable would happen. Frustrated and alone, I began calling her by different names in the hopes of masking the darkness lurking just beyond our world: Rose, Lily, even Daisy. My daughter, thank God, seemed content, cooing and gurgling in response, but my wife grew furious, hurling insults when I refused to use her chosen name. "You're making a mockery of our daughter," she screamed at me, tears spilling down her cheeks. "She deserves better than a father who's too scared to face his own demons." Each confrontation felt like nails on a chalkboard, deepening the rift, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was trying to keep Lila safe. But then it happened. One night, as I lay beside her on the bed, I awoke suddenly, drenched in sweat, a weight bearing down on my chest. I turned to check on her. Lila was gone. The nursery door stood ajar, and dread consumed me. I quickly bolted upright, racing through the dark corridors until I found her. She wasn't in her room. I searched the house, a panic setting in, with every shadow feeling alive. Just as I was about to scream her name, I heard a giggle from behind the living room curtain. I yanked it aside, and there she was, standing and staring at what seemed to be a swirling mass of darkness in the corner of the room. "Lila," I croaked, but she didn't respond. Instead, her hands stretched out toward the void, my heart shattering as the whispers grew louder, mingling with her innocent laughter. "I'm sorry," I cried, feeling every ounce of regret spill from my mouth. "We can change it. We can change your name." But the moment felt futile, as if I were shouting into a void that would consume me whole. My daughter took a step forward, and as if the very essence of the thing she faced reached out, I saw her eyes turn dark, swallowed up by a vortex I couldn't see but felt deep in my bones. Just before all resonance was lost, I lunged, snatching her up and stumbling back, my heart racing as the air around us crackled with energy. In that split second, I understood, whatever was trying to pull her in wanted her. It wanted her because of her name. Without a second thought, I screamed, "Your name isn't Lila anymore. It's Rose." The air shifted with a chilling breeze, and the darkness in the room suddenly flickered, as if contemplating its grip. I grasped her tighter, expecting every spine-tingling whisper to break me down, but it withdrew, and Lila blinked up at me, eyes wide, as if she hadn't even registered the chaos around her. I took that moment to flee, racing to my wife, who stood paralyzed in the doorway, horror etched upon her face. "We need to change her name, we need to save her," I yelled, my voice frantic, but as I spoke, I saw the realization darken my wife's eyes. I was no longer the doting father, I had become the enemy. "You've gone too far," she screamed, thrusting one hand at me, the other clutching Lila tightly. "I will never forgive you for this." And then it all crashed down. My family and I were caught in an unending battle, one I never wanted. I was left with two choices: protect my daughter from an unseen force hell-bent on claiming her soul, or face a new terror, losing the only family I ever wanted because I dared to act on a fear that was dehumanizing my love. So here I am, battling between love and fear, asking everyone if I'm the asshole for refusing to change my daughter's name. But how do you explain there's something darker lurking just beyond the veil of understanding? Something that whispers when the wind blows, waiting for weakness to snatch away the light. Would you change something innocent to preserve what you love? Is it easier to accept loss than to fight through shadows? I wonder if I might lose them both, my Lila and the warmth of my wife, so I ask you, AITA? I never thought a simple decision about Christmas morning would spiral into something that felt like a living nightmare, but here we are. My husband and I had always imagined our children waking up to a sea of colorful wrapping paper, their laughter and innocence filling the air like the smell of fresh pine from our tree. So, when my husband's parents were insistent about joining us to watch our kids open their gifts, I hesitated, not because I didn't want them there, but because of the dark, quiet secrets that always seemed to surface whenever I spent time with them. See, my in-laws have this unsettling ability to twist every joyful occasion into an underlying tension, an atmosphere thick enough to cut with a knife. The first Christmas we spent together, they arrived early, their smiles stretched too wide, their eyes too focused on my every move as I tried to set the scene of holiday cheer, and I remember my daughter's joyous squeal being overshadowed by a comment from my mother-in-law about how children shouldn't be spoiled with so much. That experience pushed me to set boundaries, and I was firm this year. "I want this to be a special moment just for us," I told my husband, who reluctantly agreed, aware of the strange weight our in-laws carried in our lives, almost like a curse that cast shadows over even the happiest days. But then Christmas morning arrived, and my excitement quickly turned into dread when I saw a text from my mother-in-law at 5 a.m., saying she couldn't wait to see them, her unwavering enthusiasm creeping under my skin like ice. I tried to shake off the unease, but it lingered like a storm cloud as I sipped my coffee, the aroma mingling with the unmistakable scent of impending chaos. I insisted to my husband that the whole family could come over later, after the presents, but he had that look, one of silent defiance, as if stepping into the battlefield to protect what little peace we had left. As the hour approached for the kids to wake, I went into survival mode, meticulously hand-picking the ornaments our daughter had decorated the night before, but the glee in my heart felt hollow. The little ones bounded in, their eyes sparkling brighter than any Christmas light, and I could almost forget the impending doom at my back, that is, until the doorbell rang just when they were about to dive into the pile of gifts. I froze, breath hitching in my throat. My husband shot me a panicked look, and I felt a wave of nausea hit me as I could only imagine who stood on the other side. Sure enough, there they were, my in-laws, faces beaming, clutching bags filled with their own presents, as if it were theirs to share. My body reacted instinctively. I stepped in front of the kids as if I could shield them from this intruding wave, all my intentions to keep Christmas pure unraveling before my eyes. "We agreed," I stuttered, my voice barely a whisper but sharp enough for them to hear. "We wanted today just for our family." For a brief moment, there was silence, and I could see my father-in-law's smile falter, flickering like a muted TV screen in a dark room, but then my mother-in-law's expression twisted, and it made me physically recoil. "Sweetheart," she said in that deceptively soft tone that made my skin crawl, "you don't want to spoil the holiday spirit, do you?" My husband stepped up to diffuse the tension, but a knot tightened in the pit of my stomach, and before I knew it, I was leading the children upstairs, almost dragging them from the scene that morphed into an argument between my husband and his parents, a battle of wills that would shatter the already fragile thread of our Christmas. I tucked the kids under my arms like precious jewels, whispering to them that everything would be okay, but their wide eyes mirrored the confusion I felt too. I could almost hear my own heart pounding above the muffled shouts from downstairs, like a metronome marking the passage of time, and despite knowing we were safe up there, I couldn't shake the feeling that something malevolent was brewing just out of sight. When I heard silence settle like dust in the aftermath of their words, I finally ventured down the hallway, only to witness the scene of my husband sitting on the couch, face pale, looking utterly broken as his parents stood above him, faces still twisted with that disconcerting blend of disappointment and determination to claim their power. "I can't believe you'd deny your children this happiness," my mother-in-law hissed. My mind spiraled, torn between wanting to run back upstairs and wanting to protect my husband from this mental assault, but when I stepped into the room, all eyes turned to me, and I instantly regretted it. "Look what you're doing to him," I shouted before thinking, and my voice echoed like a bell in a deserted abbey, cutting their glares into shards that sliced at the very fabric of our family. My husband's eyes flickered to me with a strange mixture of shame and longing, the pleading look in them begging me to stop, but there was no stopping it now. The moment had escalated into chaos, civil war waged over the rights to Christmas morning, and I felt the darkness closing in around us, a smothering shroud threatening to choke the life out of my children's excitement. I couldn't take it, couldn't breathe in that suffocating atmosphere filled with resentment, and I grabbed my kids, ushering them back upstairs, with a scream trapped in my throat. My heart pounded as our little family barricaded ourselves in, the noise of their increasingly furious voices fading into the background until all I could hear was the sound of my children's confused whispers. I tried to reassure them with soft words, but how could I explain the evils that lurked outside that door? My husband joined us moments later, yet the defeat on his face was a mirror reflecting the horrible reality. This year's Christmas was shattered, our joy stolen, and as he pulled us together, it felt like a fragile house of cards, just waiting for one more gust of wind to take it down. Hours passed, my stomach twisted in knots while the sun crept into the sky, illuminating the shadows of our crumbling home until finally, we heard the door slam. A rush of relief washed over me, but it was short-lived when my husband dared to open the door. When he peeked out, I quickly felt something dark brewing in his gaze, the kind that made my heart sink into my stomach. He turned to me, eyes glazed with disbelief, and whispered, "They're gone." The heaviness in the air was almost tangible, and I knew, in that instant, that things would never be the same. We came together, holding our children close, but the feeling of dread never left. How could we ever celebrate Christmas the same? Each year afterwards became a reminder of that singular moment, wrestling against the ropes of doubt and discontent that our own families tied around us, leaving my husband and I in a constant battle to keep our children's innocence untarnished while the darkness of anger and grief loomed just beyond the walls. I realized with a sinking heart that Christmas wasn't merely a day, it became a symbol, a battleground in my mind, a reminder that in-laws could bring a darkness unlike any other, slowly creeping in like a thief of joy, and whether it was worth the cost of keeping them away on that one single day would haunt me for the years to come. Last Thanksgiving, I found myself in a moral quandary that still chills my bones when I think back on it. My girlfriend, Mia, had a cherished family tradition of gathering every year at her grandmother's sprawling old house in the woods, a house that everyone claimed was haunted, though Mia always laughed it off as just a local legend. This year, however, I had planned a weekend fishing trip with my friends, something we had organized weeks in advance and were all looking forward to. I felt torn. Should I attend the obligatory family gathering where I'd be the outsider, or honor my pre-existing commitment? In a moment of selfishness, I chose my friends over her family's tradition, hoping it wouldn't cause too many ripples in our relationship. As soon as I made the decision, a sense of unease settled over me like a heavy fog. I was already feeling bad when I woke up Thanksgiving morning to a deluge of messages and missed calls from Mia, her voice frantic as she told me her grandmother had fallen ill and there wouldn't be any gathering. Instead, she encouraged me to enjoy my trip, but guilt clawed at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I hadn't been supportive enough. The fishing trip was almost as disappointing as it was cathartic. Every cast of my line reminded me of the warmth of family, and all I could picture was Mia's disappointment plastered across her face. As the day dragged on, though, I dismissed my worries, shrugging them off with my friends, feigning laughter as they told ghost stories around the campfire. But as night swallowed the camp in darkness, I noticed something odd, a sudden, chilling silence in the woods. The crickets stopped their chirping, and the wind held its breath. I could swear I felt eyes watching us from the shadows. Unease settled like lead in my stomach. In an attempt to shake the feeling, I stepped away from the fire, venturing into the trees on the pretext of needing to find a restroom. It wasn't long before I found myself walking deeper into the woods than intended, the moonlight barely cutting through the branches overhead. Each step was heavy, as if something sinister lurked just beyond the reach of the dim light. I turned back, heart racing, but that's when I heard the first of the whispers, soft, echoey, coming from nowhere and everywhere all at once. "Come play with us," it called, in a sing-song voice that sent icy chills down my spine. My blood ran cold as I immediately thought of the ghost stories my friends were telling. What if we had ventured too far into something that shouldn't be disturbed? I quickened my pace, trying to shake it off, but the whispers followed me back, only growing louder and more insistent. I stumbled upon what looked like an old, decrepit shack, forgotten and crumbling, draped with vines. It felt like a bad idea, but something pulled me closer, against my better judgment. Knocking on the rotten door, I felt an unnatural chill seep through my skin. The door creaked open without my touch, revealing an empty room consumed by shadows, where sunlight dared not intrude. I hesitated but stepped inside, curiosity overpowering fear. The air smelled of damp wood and decay, every instinct screamed for me to leave, but the whispers had morphed into a haunting melody that enchanted me. I turned towards a dim glimmer at the back, only for the door to slam shut behind me, locking me in darkness. Panic surged as I rattled the door, screaming for help, but my voice was swallowed by the silence. The whispers turned to gasps, a cacophony that reverberated off the walls. Then, just like that, they formed words: "You shouldn't have come here." I recoiled, my heart pounding in my ears, and that's when I saw them, children, their faces pale and hollowed, drifting through the cracks in the walls, their eyes void of warmth, staring into my soul. "You're not supposed to be here," one of them whispered, clutching my leg with a cold, trembling hand. I felt sick. This place was a prison, a nightmare trapped inside a nightmare, echoing with the spirits of those who had lost their way. I fought against the whispers, pushed against the walls of darkness, the memory of Mia losing its hold on me as the weight of despair thickened the air. I couldn't let her down, but I felt tethered to this cursed place, as if its despair were latching onto my essence. Just then, I heard footsteps outside. My friends had come looking for me. I cried out, "Help me!" But my voice was drowned in the whispers. The door rattled as they struggled to open it. And, in a moment of clarity, I realized I had to fight back against whatever this place was trying to take from me. Summoning my last reserve of strength, I hurled against the door one final time, battering it as cold fingers released their hold. I felt space open up, light cutting through the darkness. My friends pushed through, pulling me into the safety of the night. Breathless and trembling, I fell to my knees, gasping for air while the shack stood ominously behind us, silent and still. I could still hear the whispers as they faded, mingling with the wind. "You shouldn't have come," echoed softly. Shaken, I collected myself as my friends were confused, asking what had happened. I only managed to tell them I'd gotten lost when I realized I'd been gone too long. I didn't dare tell them about the whispers, about the children, about the darkness, fearing they might have walked into our very own horror story. The next day, I returned to Mia, guilt seeping into every moment. When she asked how my trip went, I smiled faintly and said it was good, suppressing the fear clawing at my insides. A few days later, her family sent out a notice that they would be selling the old house. Apparently, her grandmother had died the night I'd gotten lost. The unease returned, wrapping its fingers around my throat as the fog of dread settled back in. I realized then that I was haunted not just by the spirits of that place, but by the decision I'd made, the choice to ignore something important, something that cost more than just a gathering. To this day, the whispers linger in the back of my mind, a reminder of the tradition I snubbed, the pain I caused. I sometimes wonder if part of me is still trapped inside that shack, lost among the shadows, and I can't help but bring it up to my friends, hoping they will understand someday. But deep down, I know the truth, it's too late for that. I always thought that family gatherings were supposed to be joyful, filled with laughter and love, but for me, they were a reminder of the hollow ache in my heart, a wound that never seemed to heal. I had been married for 3 years, and despite countless doctor's appointments, hormones, and shattered hopes, I still hadn't been able to give my husband what his family craved, a grandchild. It's not that I didn't share their dream, I wanted a child as much as he did, but an insidious cloud of infertility hung over my head like a guillotine, waiting to drop at any moment. At every family dinner, the conversation would inevitably spiral toward the kids my sister-in-law was expecting or the cute stories of my husband's childhood that I had heard 1,000 times, both of which sent a fresh wave of salt water stinging my eyes that I would fight to keep at bay. As the chatter became more pronounced, I noticed the unmistakable glances my mother-in-law would cast my way, the pitying concern pooled in her eyes like the still water of a stagnant pond. I could feel her discomfort, her insistent attempts to engage me in discussions about fertility treatments under the guise of concern and support. I hated it. I hated the unwelcome attention on my most vulnerable secret, the nagging whispers that echoed through my mind. I wasn't just a woman, but a broken cog in her family's wheel. It all came to a head last Thanksgiving, the air thick with expectation as the aroma of roasted turkey drifted into my nostrils like a false promise. After we had feasted, my in-laws gathered in the living room, eyes glistening under the faded twinkle lights, chatting animatedly about future family plans. My heart raced as I sensed the shift in focus toward me, the moment when my mother-in-law cleared her throat, the precursor to her infamous "let's talk about the future" speech. "So, when do you think we might meet our grandchild?" she pried, her voice steady, though I could hear the tremor of underlying desperation. It was as if every pair of eyes turned to me with that question, the words swirling in the air like vultures, scavenging the carcass of my dreams. I felt the heat rise to my cheeks and wanted to sink into the floor, to evaporate, but instead, with a jagged breath, I simply remained silent. My husband shot me a concerned glance, his father deflected with an awkward chuckle, but the damage was done. I felt raw, exposed, and utterly furious. Why should I have to discuss my deepest pain with people who only saw me as a vessel? That evening, as tension simmered beneath the surface, I retreated to the bathroom, clutching the cool porcelain sink, my heart racing as I battled the swirling storm of emotions. The shadows seemed to whisper, urging me to confront my in-laws about the delicate matter, to reveal the truth that felt more sacramental than flesh and blood. But all I could recall was a memory, the time I had briefly shared my struggles with close friends only to hear their casual insensitivity. "You can always adopt," was an unsolicited suggestion that had dug in like nails on a chalkboard. How could I trust anyone with this? Instead of expressing my frustrations, I turned my phone off and avoided them for the rest of the evening, feigning late-night work calls and bathroom breaks to escape their probing questions. When I returned to the living room, the chatter had shifted to other topics: my sister-in-law's baby shower planning, the grand plans summer would bring, all accompanied by the laughter and affection I had once thought unbreakable. I sat back down, feeling smaller than ever as my in-laws and husband conversed with ease, laughter cascading over me like a heavy wool blanket. I couldn't help but think that I had become a ghost in my own life, floating through moments that once filled me with joy but now only reminded me of the family I was struggling to provide. In the days that followed, our house grew quiet, almost painfully so. My husband, kind and patient, tried to forge conversations around my feelings, but all I felt was a wall robbing me of my voice. I became a coward, staring down the never-ending silence whenever my in-laws called or texted. Their messages turned from curious to frustrating, filled with concern that made my skin crawl. A week later, the family WhatsApp group ignited with photographs of my sister-in-law's ultrasound, and a tear slipped down my cheek as I muted the notification, each ping a dagger twisting into my heart. I felt like the villain of my own story, the one who refused to talk about the very thing that drained life from me. In my mind, I played a relentless cycle of what-ifs. What if I talk to them? What if I shatter their dreams? What if I shatter my own? I could feel the weight of family traditions and expectations pressing down on me like I was being submerged underwater, gasping for breath and desperate for release. As the cold chill of winter set in, I avoided attending holiday celebrations, ducking out of every gathering, and insisting on working through the long weekends, all while my heart sank deeper into despair. Then came the shocking twist. One late night, while scrolling aimlessly through social media, I stumbled upon a group dedicated to fertility issues, and suddenly, there it was, a thread that ripped the bandage off the wound I had tried to shield from the world. A woman, vulnerable and raw, told of her struggles and gave voice to the very pain I feared, and I felt it resonate within me like a forgotten song. As the comments poured in, each a testament to the shared struggle, it felt like a glimmer of hope. Until she casually mentioned, "Just remember to communicate with your loved ones, they can't help you if they don't know." Her words clung to the walls of my mind, pressing against the restraints I had put in place. That night, I finally broke down, tears flowing freely as I thought of my husband, the love we shared, and the family I had allowed to slip farther away. The next day, I took a deep breath, my heart still racing, and initiated a text to my in-laws asking them to meet me for coffee. I had finally decided, it was time to talk. The moment my mother-in-law walked into the cafe, I saw the flicker of hope in her eyes, only to be overshadowed by the uncertainty of what lay beneath. We chatted about benign topics for a while, but the air was thick with unspoken words. As the steam from our drinks rose like ephemeral ghosts, I finally opened my mouth, feeling the weight of every word crash down around us like waves against the shore. I spoke of my struggles, the heartache, and the silence that had become my wall. They listened in silence, and in those moments, when the truth laid bare between us, I felt the temperature drop, an awkward pause settling like dust after a storm. To my surprise, after a few beats of silence, my mother-in-law reached across the table, her hand clutching mine, offering more than just sympathy, it was the promise of understanding. I finally began to heal, slowly but surely, yet the path wasn't easy. Some days, I faltered, the weight of expectation still looming over me, but I knew that mothering would come in many forms, perhaps not the expected route, but one that was uniquely mine. As time progressed, I became part of those family conversations, advocating for my own journey to expand our family, while embracing the unexpected joys that awaited us, understanding that familial love is resilient and can be found even in the spaces of discomfort and raw honesty. Sharing my story didn't only help my in-laws understand the pain I carried, it liberated me from its grip, transforming the way we could interact with one another. I wouldn't be the perfect daughter-in-law or the perfect mother, but I would be something far richer, an authentic member of a family that, in its messy, imperfect beauty, could truly embrace one another for who we are. Even after all the pain, I found myself craving those family gatherings, looking forward to laughter, to the inevitable questions, but also knowing that this time, I'd be able to talk about the dreams that had once felt so out of reach. So, AITA for refusing to talk to my in-laws? No, I realized, I was just human, and sometimes it takes a little courage to find the voice that lays dormant within. I never thought a simple act of sharing leftovers could tear my family apart, but here I am, sitting alone in my darkened living room, replaying that moment over and over, haunted by the consequences of my actions. My wife, Julia, owns a small but trendy restaurant in the heart of the city, and her passion for crafting the perfect menu is only matched by her relentless pursuit of culinary excellence. Last week, she prepared a spectacular feast for an important food critic, and despite the hours she labored over the dishes, it was a complete disaster. A botched soufflé and an unseasoned risotto meant for a table of 6 ended with her in tears and a table full of critics who abandoned their forks. Luckily, we had leftovers, and while I didn't think much of it at the time, I saw them as a potential treat for our 7-year-old son, Jeremy, who had been particularly picky lately. After a long day of work, I was exhausted and did what any parent would do. I heated up the remains of Julia's masterpiece, set it on the table, and watched as Jeremy devoured it, his delighted expressions making it feel like I had done something right. Little did I know, Julia returned home just moments later, her exhaustion quickly transforming into an explosive rage. She was furious when she learned I'd given her hard work to our child without asking her, saying that the food wasn't fit for a child and that it was a culinary embarrassment to have it enjoyed in our home. I tried to explain that I was merely trying to avoid a food wasteland, that I thought the meal was still tasty regardless of her standards, but every point I made only seemed to enrage her more. As the evening spiraled out of control, I had every intention of smoothing things over, only for the situation to morph from her yelling into accusations that my actions were disrespectful not only to her work but to her as a person, as if I had taken something far more valuable than overcooked risotto and an unappetizing soufflé. I felt as though I was losing my grasp on both my wife and the situation, and so did the unthinkable. Under the weight of her disappointment and anger, I snapped back at her, suggesting she should have been more focused on the food quality and less on the critics. How easy it was for her to blame me for a problem that simmered deeper. It was the moment she turned silent, eyes glaring, that I realized the words had crossed an irretrievable line, that I had launched us into a war I never intended to start. For days afterward, the silence felt like a living thing, hovering over our home, punctuated only by Jeremy's innocent inquiries about why Mommy seemed so upset. Julia's repertoire of silence was filled with passive-aggressive remarks and cold, short responses, her eyes narrowing when I tried to engage in anything beyond the bare minimum of conversation necessary to ensure the basic functions of family life, a stark contrast to the vivacious, affectionate woman I had fallen in love with. I had hoped we'd recover after the initial fallout, but instead, Julia's resentment festered, and soon it morphed into something darker, something almost devoid of love and warmth. She became distant, pouring herself into work at the restaurant, where she would stay late and celebrate a new batch of customers with food I wondered if she served with love or simply out of spite for me. And then came the night I sat down at my computer, typing an online thread about the entire situation. I titled it AITA for giving my kid my wife's restaurant leftovers. I poured out everything that had transpired, desperate for an outside perspective, only to be met with a storm of judgment, thousands declaring that I was the ultimate not only for disregarding her cooking but for taking away her art without even asking. The comments cut deeper than Julia's shrillest reprimands, each one a dagger twisting in my heart. Did I truly not appreciate her work? Did I really ruin what little glimmer of happiness we shared? In a whirlwind of frustration and guilt, I posted it, hoping maybe some kind souls would understand my side, but I only sunk deeper into despair. I couldn't see my reflection in her eyes anymore. It was as if she were gazing at a stranger, one who had cheated her out of validation and respect. Days turned into weeks filled with awkward dinners and increasingly frequent texts from concerned friends, worried about the cracks forming in our once solid relationship, while I spiraled into a pit of confusion and sadness. By now, any semblance of peace was gone. When I finally approached Julia to talk, her reaction was icy as she bristled and turned her back on me, my heart breaking at the sight of her shoulders hunched, each part of her signaling the grief I had caused. I tried to muster the strength to fight for our family, but it crumbled like stale bread, and Jeremy ended up sandwiched in between our personal warfare, his innocent laughter becoming a haunting reminder of our shared happiness, a skin-deep gallery of memory eclipsed by an ominous cloud. I racked my head trying to fix things, bring back that laughter, but all I found was bitterness, a constant reminder that I was perhaps wholly to blame. The last straw came on the night when Jeremy begged us to take him out to eat. I attempted to suggest we go to Julia's restaurant, a familiar comfort, but she scowled, her face freezing in a way I had understatedly believed was an unthinkable facet of my once joyful wife, and she snapped that she would rather eat trash than step foot in a place bearing my name. I had turned to Jeremy, hoping his innocent spirit could bridge the chasm between us, and when I caught a glimpse of disappointment in his eyes, I knew I had failed. Days turned into months, and everything I tried had been met with veiled hostility. I became a ghost in my own home, a failure neither of us knew how to fix, and one afternoon, a provocative thought pricked at the edges of my mind. Maybe if she couldn't see the value in me anymore, perhaps it was time to remove myself from the equation, let Julia and Jeremy continue thriving without the emotional wreckage that had invaded our lives. So, when I quietly packed a bag and slipped out the door for one last stroll, leaving my phone behind in my attempt to free us from the chaos, I thought it was the right decision. As evening settled in, I found myself wandering toward Julia's restaurant, every step heavy with resolve to push through the hurt, to give closure to my irreparable mistakes. Standing outside the bright lights and vibrant people, I took a breath to gather the courage. I was finally going to admit my faults and appeal for forgiveness, but as I stepped inside, I was greeted not with the comforting aroma of home-cooked meals but by the sight of Julia beside a tall man with an easy grin, laughing over plates that I'd once served my family. Suddenly, I found myself at the precipice of realization. In seeking to share a simple meal with my son, I had unwittingly starved the love in our home, and now it looked as though I had ushered in someone else's warmth. Maybe the leftovers were more than just food, maybe they were a reflection of the way I threw away months of fragile moments, scoffing at the delicacies we had once nourished together, and I realized, standing frozen in a place that had once felt like home, that the hardest truth any parent could face isn't just about what we serve our children, but what we allow to fill their hearts. I've always loved Thanksgiving, the extended family gatherings, the laughter, the food, and even the familiar bickering. This year, though, was different. My cousin Eric's girlfriend, Amanda, was 3 months pregnant and had decided to join us, which everyone was excited about, except for me. For some reason, Amanda had that air of drama swirling around her, a sort of chaotic energy that made me uneasy. The moment she stepped into my house, I felt a chill skitter down my spine. I didn't know if it was the winter wind or something about her gaze that seemed to promise trouble. Everyone else cooed over her, patted her belly, shared stories of their own parenting experiences, but I kept my distance. That night, as we all settled in for the Thanksgiving feast, my mom revealed there weren't enough beds in the house, so Amanda would have to sleep on the couch. This sparked an argument. Eric went all protective mode, insisting she could take his room, but my parents put their foot down, explaining that the couch was more than enough for one night. I felt a strange satisfaction wash over me as I watched Amanda's cheeks flush with anger, though I would later wish I'd kept that emotion locked away. After dinner, while everyone was engrossed in swapping family stories, I pulled Amanda aside, half expecting an apology, but instead, she confronted me with this glint in her eye that made me take a step back. "You think I'm here to ruin your perfect Thanksgiving? You don't know the half of it," she hissed. I wanted to laugh it off, but there was a flicker of something maniacal in her voice, something that said she wasn't just kidding. I shrugged it off, returning to the warmth of family, which suddenly felt a little too warm, suffocating under layers of heated conversations. Hours passed, and we finally retired for the night, but I didn't sleep well. I kept hearing faint whispers from the living room, the cadence of voices, but it wasn't just my family. It felt like there was something lurking outside the perimeter of our joy, creeping in with every soft chuckle and snicker. Around 2 a.m., I heard a loud thud, a sound that jolted me awake. I leapt from my bed and rushed into the living room, my heart pounding, ready to confront whatever had woken me. The couch was empty, Amanda was gone. Feeling a sense of dread stewing in my stomach, I called for her, and the sound echoed through the dark house, but there was no answering call. Panic set in as I sprinted to the front door. It was ajar, the cold night air swirling in threateningly, and I stepped outside, scanning the shadows, my breath coming in quick, icy puffs. That's when I spotted her, huddled against the porch railing, whispering frantically into her phone. As I got closer, I could hear the sharpness in her voice, the words turning into erratic sentences. "No, it's a mistake. They don't know yet, just keep it hidden. I'll figure it out. Just give me more time." My skin prickled, a chill gripped me as dread wrapped tightly around my throat. Before I could speak, she turned, and the look in her eyes, one of sheer panic, became engraved in my mind. "You shouldn't be out here," she said sharply, her demeanor shifting, an unsettling mask slipping into place. I stepped back, feeling quite small, while her expression turned to something darker. As I tried to recover the right words, there was a sudden rustle from behind me. I whipped around to see a figure emerge from the shadows, silhouette lurking just beyond the porch light. It looked like a man, tall and cloaked in darkness, but I couldn't make out his features. Amanda froze, then dropped her phone, eyes wide, and in that instant, I knew there was something utterly wrong. The man advanced toward us, a slow, predatory movement, and my instincts screamed at me to run, but my feet felt glued to the ground. Horror rendered me immobile. "You should have listened," the man growled, and with that, Amanda turned and bolted, the sound of her footsteps like thunder across the wooden porch. The man followed, and I finally snapped out of my stupor, rushing back inside and locking the door behind me, my breath ragged as I tried to gather my thoughts. I could hear Eric shouting her name from the other room, frantic and terrified as we all scrambled into the dark, hushed living room, the turkey and stuffing forgotten. We fanned out, searching for her, but it felt like an eternity until I spotted her through the frosted window, the shape of her bracing against the cold while Eric bellowed out pleas for her to come back. The man was gone, vanished into the ether like a specter of our worst fears. It was then I noticed the small puddle at my feet. I crouched down, the blood rushing to my ears, and I felt something cold grip my heart when I realized it was Amanda's phone, cracked and broken, the screen still lit. I picked it up and saw the last message on the screen: "Everything is in place. Just make it through the night." My blood ran cold as I looked at Eric, his face pale, worry-etching lines in his forehead, all of us frozen at that moment, tethered to a mystery that suddenly felt too close to home. Thanksgiving stretched into a nightmarish spiral of frantic calls and desperate searching, turning from family connections to sheer terror as Eric's pleas devolved into frenzied screaming the moment he learned Amanda was gone. We all felt it, a stranglehold of unease cloaked around our hearts. The police arrived, and everything blurred into chaos. They asked questions, but the answers were lost in disbelief, and in the flurry of sirens and blue lights, I felt a growing chasm of guilt filling my chest. It was my insistence on making Amanda sleep on the couch that had set this night into motion. Eric clung to the slice of hope that turned into despair as the hours crept on, tainted by the realization that we were merely pieces on a board of a game we never signed up for. In the end, they labeled it an abduction, a cold case that wouldn't let rest. That Thanksgiving, once filled with so much joy, morphed into a haunting echo in my mind, a chilling reminder that sometimes, the shadows of our decisions extend far beyond the light we perceive. I haven't been able to shake off the guilt, especially since the day Amanda disappeared was the day that I realized my family would never be the same. Now, every Thanksgiving brings back that crushing reality, a stain on our memories, and I can't help but wonder if she's still out there somewhere waiting, or if she's merely a ghost in the hollow echoes of family gatherings, sleeping on a couch that will forever remain vacant, a haunting reminder that some choices lead us to darkness, where the light can no longer reach. Last month, I found myself caught in a whirlwind of chaos that turned my quiet suburban life upside down, all because of my near-adult son's gluten intolerance, which frankly seemed to surface just as he was nearing 18, insisting on gluten-free meals while treating me like the villain for refusing to cater to his whims. It all started innocently enough when I was rummaging through a dusty box of old family recipe cards, hoping to rediscover the love I once had for cooking, but the sound of my son's voice interrupted my daydreams of homemade pasta, the way he breathlessly announced his new dietary demands as if he had just won the lottery, and my heart sank, thinking of the ravaged gluten-filled meals we shared, the memories now tainted by his self-imposed culinary prison. I told him that cooking had always been a joy for me, but now it felt like I was being shackled with chains with every new gluten-free request, and yet there was something deeper I noticed in his eyes. A kind of desperation that struck me as odd, as if this was less about the food and more about something he wasn't telling me. But when I asked him why all of a sudden gluten was the enemy, he merely shrugged, muttering roughly about feeling better since spring started, and looking for a sense of control in a world that was rapidly falling apart around him. Still, no matter how many times I attempted to reason with him, he insisted on staying gluten-free, refusing any family meals I prepared unless they fit his strict parameters, which left me feeling like I was losing my grip on him. What's worse, he had a penchant for dragging me into his world of restrictive eating, and soon I was spending sleepless nights scrolling gluten-free recipes that felt more like torture than genuine interest. The thought of denying him any kind of dinner out together gnawed at my conscience, yet I was firm in my belief that he was simply going through a phase, the phase of teenage rebellion taken too far. And when he turned the heat up, I finally knew I had to put my foot down, refusing to take him out for meals, holding on to the hope that someday he'd break free of this ridiculous gluten-free fad and return to the son I once knew. My refusal only escalated tensions in our home, with every shared meal now threatening to collapse into an argument, and that's when things began to shift. I noticed something strange about the food I had started preparing. Dishes that had once been a source of comfort now felt tainted, an ominous shadow creeping into my kitchen. The taste of my chicken soup became metallic. Nothing matched up with memories of laughter and family gatherings around the table, as I shivered with the knowledge that something darker lurked within my own walls. Then, one evening while cleaning the basement, I stumbled upon an old recipe hidden beneath a pile of dust, scrawled in my late grandmother's handwriting, speaking of a healing herb, warning of its powers and how it could twist the body in response to the words sent out, and I couldn't help but feel a creeping dread that the reason for my son's sudden gluten intolerance wasn't a passing fad but something rooted in generations of our family, lingering remnants of old-world knowledge entwined with strange and twisted practices that we inherited without question, as if the very act of cooking was a ritual now twisted in ways we never understood. Inevitable outcomes loomed closer with each meal I prepared, twisting the knife further, the moment I faced him again over dinner after unearthing it, trying to mask my concern behind a veneer of normalcy. I watched as he devoured the food, his face twisting with each bite, making me question my own choices. The walls around us seemed to breathe as I asked if he liked the meal, praying for a different answer, when suddenly, everything fell silent. The fork slipped from his fingers, crashing against the plate as he doubled over. The horror on his face resonated with heartbreak. And I finally realized how the tables had turned. This wasn't just a diet where he could choose what to eat. It was metaphorically chaining his essence, his very being, transforming him into something I could barely recognize. Was it the food, the recipes, or something else entirely that sparked feelings of dread? Fat panic rising in my throat as he gasped, pleading with red-rimmed eyes for some semblance of gluten just to make it stop. Each breath he gasped fully paralyzing me into place as fear coursed through me, and, in one moment of despair, I understood. I no longer had the power to create meals that nurtured and healed, but ones that hurt and betrayed. The panic only heightened when I realized time was running out, and my only option was to regain some semblance of control, but that control had slipped through my fingers, out of reach, like grains of gluten he no longer seemed able to stomach. I raced back to the basement, frantically flipping through those weathered recipe cards in search for the herb, hoping against hope that maybe I could salvage something from this mess before it consumed us both, when all the while, I couldn't shake the horrifying thought that I might just be the monster feeding the curse, forced to come to terms with a truth I wasn't prepared to face, that the answer to our demise might have been hidden down in dark corners far deeper than either of us could have ever imagined. I always thought of my sister as my best friend, but everything changed when she married Mark. He was charming at first, but something about him gave me the creeps, like he was always watching, calculating. When they moved into the same town, I was excited to be closer to her, but the more I interacted with Mark, the more I sensed his controlling nature lurking beneath the surface. I'd find myself cringing at the way he spoke to her, each word coated in a smug arrogance that seemed to grow brazen as time went on. He'd often interrupt her, making her laugh off his jabs like they were just bad jokes while I could see the hurt flash across her face. I tried to talk to her about it once, but she brushed it off, insisting he was just being protective, and I could feel an icy wall build between us as she defended him. But there was something inside me that refused to back down. It felt wrong, like watching a slow train wreck you were powerless to stop. Then one afternoon, as I walked by a florist, an idea sprouted in my mind, dark, mischievous, and maybe a little vindictive. I decided to send her flowers anonymously, nothing too extravagant, just a simple bouquet with a note that read, "You deserve better." At first, I thought it would lift her spirits, a small reminder that she was loved outside of her marriage, but when I saw the hurt in her eyes during dinner as she showed them to Mark, everything took a horrifying twist. He exploded, throwing around accusations that I was trying to seduce her, that I'd always been jealous of their relationship, and my heart sank as I realized the depth of his paranoia. To keep the peace, she apologized, but I swore I saw a flicker of recognition in her gaze, a silent acknowledgement that maybe I was right. The next week, I sent another bouquet, more elaborate this time, with a note that said, "You're worth so much more than this." Her laughter was hollow when she showed them to Mark, who turned scarlet, eyes blazing. He snapped at her, demanding to know who was sending the flowers, and this time, I could see the chains tightening around her. The fragile smile she offered cracked under the weight of his fury, and I felt sick to my stomach knowing I was the catalyst for his wrath. I thought she'd open up to me, confide in me about how she felt trapped, but instead, she retreated into herself, and for weeks, I would hear her forced laughter from the other room, as if she were trying to convince herself everything was fine. I hesitated to send another bouquet, but my urge to protect her consumed me. It screamed that I had to keep hope alive somehow. So, I decided to send a single red rose with the note, "Remember who you are." When she found it, Mark threw a fit so intense I could hear him all the way from my apartment, the walls shaking with his forced masculinity. I worried he'd become abusive, prayed he wouldn't cross that line, but every time I saw her, I sensed more cracks appearing in her facade. I could tell she was unhappy now. The strained look on her face told me everything I needed to know, but still, she didn't say a word to me. Days turned to weeks, and with every flower, I felt the line between caring older brother and meddling lunatic blurring. One night, I received an unmarked envelope on my doorstep, and when I opened it, my heart stopped. It was a photograph of me taken from an angle that could only have been taken from the window of my apartment, followed by an ominous note saying, "Stop." Fear gripped me, tightening like a vice. I knew it was Mark, threatening me that I was crossing some line, but a part of me didn't care. I contemplated reaching out to my sister, but I knew it would only unleash hell. I was trapped in this spiral, unable to save her without destroying our relationship entirely. As I lay awake at night, the resolution to protect her only grew. Mark was a disease, and I was an antibiotic trying to fight it, so I decided to make one last move. I hired a private investigator to gather evidence, to follow Mark and see who he really was, hoping I could save her from whatever hell he had dragged her into. The investigator uncovered chilling truths. Mark had a record of harassment with previous girlfriends, and he'd been reported multiple times for suspicious behavior. Armed with evidence, I finally confronted my sister, pouring out everything I had learned in a desperate attempt to reach her. But instead of relief, something in her demeanor changed. Her eyes hardened as she turned away, and my heart sank. She called Mark immediately, and when he arrived, the storm that followed was catastrophic. He accused me of stalking him, of invading our lives, and I was filled with such dread when she didn't defend me that I knew I had lost her. My heart twisted as I realized the depths of her loyalty to him, a loyalty he had fostered through manipulation and fear. That night, I sat in fog-filled despair, staring at the walls of my lonely apartment, my phone buzzing with messages from my sister saying she never wanted to talk to me again, that I had ruined her life. My gut twisted. The only sound in the room was my shaky breaths as I mourned the loss of her light in my life. But then, just as I thought things couldn't get worse, the investigator called me with urgent news. Mark had a plan to leave the state with my sister. Panic coursed through my veins like ice as I rushed to her apartment, ready to beg her to stay, to fight for her. But when I arrived, I found the door ajar, the shadows inside stretching like nightmares, and the heavy quiet beckoning me to step into what felt like doom. I called out her name, dread flooding my senses, and when I stepped inside, the chilling sight I found left my heart in shards. The living room was a mess, overturned furniture, shattered glass, and in the center of it all, my sister, the fear painted across her face, standing before Mark who was seething with rage. I didn't recognize the man I once thought charming. He was a monster now, and before I could think, my protective instincts kicked in. I lunged forward, and what followed was a blur. Mark shouted something about betrayal, and as I fell, the two of us clashed in a tangle of limbs and fury. In that moment, I knew I had crossed a line, but my concern morphed into desperation as I tried to shield her from his rage. Then, in an instant, it shifted. I suddenly saw the fear in her eyes, but not for Mark. She was afraid of me. The realization hit hard as I stumbled back, horror-stricken to see her stance alongside him. "You have to leave. You're only making everything worse," she screamed, and the betrayal pierced through me like a knife. As the weight of her words sank in, I felt the ground fall beneath me, devastation swirling in my chest like a vast ocean of despair. The door slammed shut behind me as the frantic isolation pressed in around me. I grasped the fire escape's railing, doubled over in disbelief, then sat numbly against the cool metal, feeling the world morph into a blurred haze. That's when I realized it. I had become the monster. All my actions, my desperate attempts to save her had only led to more suffering. In trying to rescue her from a controlling husband, I had become someone who cornered her into a space of fear. And as I sat there overcome with emptiness, the shadows around me grew more oppressive. I could almost hear Mark's smug laughter echoing in the stillness, and for a fleeting moment, a chilling thought took root. Maybe those flowers had turned into something dark. Were they ever truly about helping her, or had I just harmed the only person I loved? At that moment, I realized I would never be able to sleep soundly again. AITA for refusing to go to my meals for dinner anymore. Most days, I feel guilty about it, but after the last experience, there's no way I can ever set foot in her house again. It started innocently enough. My husband and I had been married for a few years, and his mother insisted on hosting a weekly Sunday dinner. I used to enjoy those meals, filled with laughter and stories, but after the first incident, enjoyment shifted to dread. The first time it happened, we arrived to find the table lavishly set, but a deep chill permeated the air, something off, like stepping into a mausoleum. I brushed it off, chalked it up to an odd draft or maybe too many candles, but I swear it felt like we were being watched. As dinner began, my husband's mother started talking about her collection. Instead of dishes or porcelain cats, she was referring to disturbing shadows moving in the corners of her home, whispers that crept through the walls. "You must listen closely," she said, her voice dropping an octave as her eyes flickered to the corners. "They have stories to tell." I laughed nervously, hoping it was all a joke, but she was dead serious, her gaze drowning in something dark, almost tangible, and I shared an uneasy glance with my husband. I could see the flicker of worry in his eyes. Dinner continued, each course more unsettling than the last, her smile curving like a crescent moon, and I found myself staring at the chicken, the skin too pale, almost sickly. The way it glistened under the light turned my stomach. As the evening wore on, I could feel a sinister presence lingering just outside the reach of my peripheral vision. After the meal, she insisted we look at her newest acquisition, leading us to a small, dusty room at the back of the house. Inside was a large mirror, its surface warped, the kind you see in horror movies. The reflections never quite match reality. My heart raced as she began to explain. She claimed the mirror reflected not just our images, but souls, capturing the essence of those within its grasp. My husband awkwardly laughed it off, but my skin prickled with unease. Then came the fateful moment. She said we should gather together before the mirror for a family picture, claiming it can bond us forever. My husband jokingly pushed his shoulders back, confidence evidently faltering as I hesitated, the air thickening, a weight pressing down on my chest as I moved closer. As the camera clicked, I felt something shift behind me. I turned and caught a flicker of movement, something dark and serpentine writhing against the wall. I gasped, but when I looked again, it was gone, dissolved into the shadows where the light didn't quite reach. I thought maybe I was just imagining it, but I could sense something watching. We hurried out after that, but not without an overwhelming guilt for my sudden sense of dread. When we visited the following week, I could feel the strange tension ballooning. The air at the dinner table felt tight, like a noose, everything a stifling echo of the past. My mother-in-law, ever so perceptive, picked up on my discomfort. "Do you see them?" she whispered during dessert, her eyes glinting with a strange fervor. For a moment, panic clawed at my throat. I didn't want to admit to any unseen horrors. See? What? I responded with a trembling voice, and she only smiled wider, revealing far too many teeth. That night, I couldn't shake an icy grip wrapping around my spine. I had horrific nightmares of dark figures closing in, whispering my name, clawing at the edges of my sanity. It felt so real, and when I woke up, heart racing, drenched in sweat, I resolved to tell my husband I couldn't go back. He took it poorly, surprised by my sudden shift, but I urged him to listen. I knew something was very wrong, but he just laughed it off, chalking it up to an overstimulating imagination. The following week, I decided to confront her. I don't want to come to dinner anymore, I stated flatly. Her face contorted, suddenly aging before my eyes, her smile stretching unnaturally wide. But the others? The family needs you, she hissed, and at that moment, her eyes darkened until they were like two voids, and I remembered every ghostly whisper she had let linger in the air. I racked my brain to think of an excuse, any reason to get out of it, but the second I did, she gripped my wrist with a surprising ferocity, and I felt a jolt of sickness clawing my insides. You're one of us now, you belong to the collection, her voice was low, rumbling from deep within her. Panic surged through me, and I yanked my hand free. I told my husband I couldn't do this any longer, that I couldn't bear to be part of an acquisition or collection, that I needed peace away from those dreadful dinners. It was easier said than done. Eventually, he accepted my request, albeit begrudgingly. But every now and then, he would ask me why I was being unreasonable, why I couldn't just come back for one dinner. My resolve was tested again when weeks passed, and I started to sense a strange displacement at home, an emptiness settling over our lives. My husband habitually mentioned how much his mother missed me, and with time, I could see shadows again, thicker than before, creeping along the walls at night, creeping into my dreams. My sleep was invaded by visions of dark reflections whispering my name, twisting and warping into shapes I couldn't comprehend. I began hearing muffled words drifting through the air, begging me to return, to join them, but I fought against it, focusing on the love that had once surrounded us. That's when I found the pictures. I was looking through an old family album when I stumbled upon our last photo taken before the mirror. My heart dropped as I studied the photograph. My husband was smiling, but behind him, I could see it, an inky shadow, clawing and stretching out of the periphery, its eyes glinting with malicious intent. I showed the picture to my husband, but he only shook his head, unable to see what I saw through the darkness. Despair clawed at me. How could I return to that dinner table and face those malicious whispers again? That night, I laid awake, trying to rationalize it all when I heard it. Whispering, insistent, calling for me. They were back, the dark figures pressing in closer until I couldn't breathe. In my desperation to escape, I ran to our bedroom mirror, and there, in the reflection, was my mother-in-law, her face twisted in that ghastly smile, a prism of shadows coiling around her as she spoke. You belong to the collection, sweet girl, she hissed, and with every sip of breath, the shadows deepened, encroaching not just in the mirror reflection but swallowing me into a maelstrom of darkness. I cried out, tore myself away from the mirror, icy fingers chasing me, chasing the hollow pit in my stomach. I made the worst decision ever. I called my husband to come see it. He needed to understand. But when he hurried to my side, she was gone, the mirror only reflecting my panic-stricken face. The whispers intensified, and I gasped as the reflections began to shape into the forms of those I didn't recognize, past family dinners replaying shadows of forgotten loves, lost souls trapped in that grim essence. As I bolted out of the mirror's gaze, dread enveloped me, and a horrifying truth surged as I grasped the reality. That mirror was a trap, an ancient device luring me into her collection, binding me with the dark remnants of her family that would never let me go. I knew, without a single doubt, returning meant becoming part of that burgeoning collection forever, and that's when I finally understood AITA for refusing to go to my mills for dinner anymore. No, I was simply fighting to keep my soul intact. Ever since my parents divorced, family gatherings had started morphing into tense affairs, but nothing could have prepared me for the fallout when my dad's ex, Marla, showed up unexpectedly one rainy evening, drenched and disheveled, claiming she'd been evicted. As the thunder rumbled outside, I could feel the weight of her presence in our living room, a far cry from the woman I remembered, her usual vibrant laugh now reduced to a shaky whisper as she recounted her misfortunes to my dad, leaning heavily on the coffee table as if it was the only thing keeping her upright. I hung back in the hallway, my heart pounding. My instincts screamed that her flimsy excuses masked something darker, but my dad's sympathetic nods only fueled my unease. I knew how her charm could woo even the most skeptical, and as they discussed her dire situation, I felt something in the pit of my stomach twist. I'd heard the stories of her reckless behavior, her penchant for manipulation, and how she had once left my dad stranded in a sleazy motel with nothing but a change of clothes. My dad was generous to a fault, the kind of man who would give his last dime to someone in need, and while I admired his compassion, I worried he would fall prey to her act once again. I finally decided I couldn't remain a spectator. I stepped into the living room, my palms sweaty and my heart racing as I interrupted their conversation, my voice steadier than I felt. "Dad, we can't let her stay here." The room fell silent. Marla's eyes narrowed, simmering with an anger I had never seen directed toward me before. She quickly masked it with a feigned pout, and my dad's face twisted with confusion. "What do you mean?" "She needs help." I pressed on, my resolve hardening as I recounted her past, how she dragged him through the mud time and time again. "She's not just going to use us as a safety net to escape her own choices." Instead of the agreement I had anticipated, my dad waved my words away, his disappointment cutting deeper than my rejection of Marla seemed to sting her. In a dramatic turn, she dropped her head, feigning tears, and I saw the game in the way her lower lip trembled. "Are you really going to let her down?" My conscience screamed as she pointedly glanced at the spare room door. I fought back the urge to argue as the storm outside intensified, matching the tortured silence in the house. It felt as if lightning would split open the very roof above us. "I just need a week. Just until I get back on my feet," she pleaded, but I knew from experience that 1 week could turn into 1 month and then 1 year. The atmosphere thickened with tension. I could feel my dad wavering, torn between compassion and the realization that I was right, and it made my heart ache. "I'm sorry, but I still think she should leave," I said quietly, desperate to end this stalemate. Marla pressed her lips together, rage igniting behind her eyes as if I had personally insulted her. My dad's expression turned unreadable, a mixture of disappointment and frustration swirling like the storm outside. The minute tension bubbled over when she stood up suddenly, rage burning like cold fire in her eyes as she spat out, "You're going to regret this, kid." I took a step back, the hairs on my neck standing on end, and as she stormed out of the room, I felt an unsettling chill creep in, an inclination that I had just summarized a series of escalating consequences. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that Marla would not simply let this go. The rain pattered on the roof gently, an eerie lullaby, but her parting words echoed violently through my mind. I tried to convince myself I had done the right thing, but deep down, a whisper niggled at me. Was I wrong to protect my space? The dread followed me into sleep, laced in vivid nightmares of lightning flashes illuminating her figure lurking outside, watching, waiting, as if planning her next move. Days turned into weeks, and the unease settled around our house like an unwelcome fog. The rain had stopped, but every time I stepped outside, the air had that charged quality, a sense of impending doom clinging to me. My fears were validated when strange things began to happen. First, it was the missing items, my favorite jacket, a set of headphones, even my car keys disappeared from plain sight. I dismissed it as misplacing them until I found a single deliberate note tucked beneath my pillow, written in a chaotic scrawl that sent shivers down my spine. "Freedom isn't free." Panic began swelling in me as every day someone knocked on our door, or my phone buzzed with an unknown number only to drop to silence as I answered, the static echoing heavily in the air. My dad tried brushing off my concerns, attributing everything to paranoia, his belief in second chances overshadowing my growing dread. I could feel him slipping further from me, and Marla was utilizing that as her tool. It wasn't until one evening, out of nowhere, I found my dad pacing the living room, his expression lost and strained as he cradled the numerous eviction notices piling up on the table. When I strayed closer, glancing at the papers and unable to comprehend why they would impact us, he looked at me helplessly. "She said she would help us." The final thread stretched to a breaking point. I felt the world around me collapse as gravity lost its grip. It wasn't Marla invading our home that terrified me, it was this silent truth that had woven its way into our lives like poison. I raced to my phone, dialing my dad's number with shaking hands, my own heart racing with desperation. I could hear my heart thudding against the walls of my chest like a war drum, and just then, my heart sank when I saw the screen light up minutes later with a familiar unknown number. I hesitated, every gut instinct screaming at me not to answer, but curiosity won. As I lifted the phone to my ear, that same chaotic laughter echoed through the receiver, cruel and mocking. "Didn't I tell you you'd regret it, kid?" It dawned on me, horrifyingly, just how much I had underestimated her. The line crackled with her malevolent glee, and a chill coursed through me like ice. Yet I found my voice. "What do you want?" She responded slowly, each word dripped in venom. "You owe me for all I did for your father. I'll be a part of your life whether you like it or not." I nearly dropped the phone, mouth dry as panic surged, 1,000 terrible possibilities racing through my mind. That night I barricaded my bedroom door, adrenaline pumping as paranoia took hold. Each creak of the house felt sinister. It lingered like a sentient creature, watching for a moment of vulnerability. I knew she was out there, somewhere in the haze, waiting for the perfect moment to make her next move, and with that, I had everything I had wanted to regain balance slip through my fingers. AITA for suggesting my teacher host my son's party at her house? It all started innocently enough. My son Ethan had turned 8, and in the excitement of planning his birthday party, I wanted to make it unforgettable. After all, this was the age where friendships began to solidify, and I wanted Ethan to feel special. I had toyed with the idea of renting a hall or throwing a backyard barbecue, but nothing felt quite right. It needed a personal touch, something more intimate. That's when I remembered Ms. Keller, Ethan's third-grade teacher, who had been nothing short of extraordinary. She had a way of bringing magic into mundane lessons, turning math classes into treasure hunts and history into exciting adventures, and I thought, why not? It was a bit of a stretch, but her massive Victorian-style house, filled with books and nooks, could be the perfect backdrop for a meaningful gathering. I approached her after school one day, my heart pounding in my chest, and suggested it as a wild idea. To my surprise, she considered it. Her smile softened into something more contemplative, as she brushed a loose strand of hair behind her ear and nodded thoughtfully, but she never agreed. Weeks passed, and the conversation slipped from memory until I received a text from her, asking if I wanted to meet for coffee, where she revealed she had been thinking about hosting the party at her house after all, citing how her own children loved the space. My heart soared. It was the answer I'd dreamed of, and I quickly agreed. The days leading up to the party were filled with excitement and anticipation. Every time Ethan smiled or laughed, I felt like I was on top of the world, relishing the fact that my crazy idea had manifested into reality. Then, the night of the party came. The kids flooded into Ms. Keller's grand home. Laughter echoed through her hallways, filled with the sweet scent of homemade cookies and the sound of balloons popping. I was caught up in a whirlwind of joy, glancing at Ms. Keller, who seemed to glide effortlessly between the children, her voice a gentle breeze among the giggles, until everything took a strange turn. Around 9, when half the kids were exhausted, I noticed Ethan drifting toward the basement door, which was slightly ajar, hesitant fingers reaching for the handle. "Ethan, no." I called out, the warning tearing from my lips as I rushed toward him, a sudden chill creeping into my veins. Ms. Keller was right behind me, her smile flickering as she gently reprimanded him, offering a promise of games and laughter above, but the glint in her eyes turned steely for the briefest second, sending a shiver crawling up my spine. I dismissed the incident, attributing my unease to exhaustion, and helped set up the cake. But the atmosphere thickened as the night wore on, the joyous laughter stagnant against an ill wind that seemed to seep in from nowhere. I watched as one by one, the children began to act strangely. They would pause mid-laugh, eyes wide as if something had whispered their names. The cake remained untouched, and the adults murmured amongst themselves, glancing nervously at the basement door that somehow drew attention like a gaping maw ready to swallow the unwary. It creaked open again, and I lost my breath when I saw tiny shadows moving in the dimness, figures that looked like children but were all wrong, limbs out of proportion, faces stretched or twisted in unnatural ways. One child, my neighbor's son, stumbled back up the stairs and pointed a trembling finger toward the door, and I suddenly realized none of the kids had gone in, but rather, something had come out. Ms. Keller quickly ushered them away, her demeanor shifting, sternness painting her features. I was struck by a sense of dread deeper than fear. I fumbled for my phone, frantically attempting to call the police when Ms. Keller approached, an unsettling calm settling over her. "Everything's fine, really," she said, her voice smooth like honey but edged with steel. "Just let them play." Then she looked beyond me and smiled, but I could feel it, a wave of malevolence rolling off her as the basement door creaked open wider, and a chilling breeze clawed at my back. Panic bubbled up inside me as I gripped Ethan's arm and started toward the door, but the children were transfixed, eyes locked on the darkness below. "You're being silly," Ms. Keller whispered with a hint of irritation, glancing over at the basement while the lights flickered ominously. "They just want to play a game." I felt the icy grip of dread tighten around me. The playfulness of the party had warped into something grotesque, as if the children were entranced by the shadowed figures whispering promises they could not resist. I turned and bolted for the door, dragging Ethan with me, but behind me, I could hear Miss Keller's sweet voice laced with something sinister. "Ethan, we have so much more fun to have down here," she beckoned, her tone shifting like the wind, and everything in me screamed to flee. I yanked him toward the exit just as chaos erupted. The children screamed, not in delight but in pure terror as the twisted forms slinked further into the light, and the laughter turned into shrieks. I burst through the front door, practically tearing Ethan into the night as the darkness behind me stirred, shadows swirling like tempests through Miss Keller's home. The last thing I saw before slamming the door shut was her eyes, two glimmering voids that seemed to absorb both light and life. We didn't stop running until we reached our car parked at the end of the street, panting and gasping as I shoved Ethan into the passenger seat, fumbling for my keys. It wasn't until we were far away, the glow of Miss Keller's charming house in the distance, that I dared to glance at him, and when I did, everything felt wrong. His eyes were wide, not with fear, but a strange, otherworldly calm, and I realized with dawning horror that he had begun to mimic the same expression I had seen on those twisted children. I glanced back at him, trying to shake off the terror, desperate to hold on to the warmth of normalcy, and as the night deepened around us, doubt crept in. Did I just ruin my son's birthday, or had I unwittingly invited something far worse? I shuddered thinking of Miss Keller, now a blend of menace and charm, waiting at the edge of darkness for another innocent soul, and with each mile, a single thought screamed in my mind: was this all my fault? The moment I stepped into my classroom that dreary Thursday morning, I could feel a heaviness in the air, a tension coiling like a serpent about to strike, and as the morning sun struggled to filter through the grimy windows, my heart sank when I noticed a sea of students excitedly whispering in the corners, their eyes darting towards Sophia, a bright-eyed, hopeful 15-year-old with an infectious smile that often lit up the room. She had been dreaming of her quinceañera for years, a celebration of her transition into womanhood, and as her teacher, I could see the crescendo of her hopes building with each passing day, especially as she summoned the courage to approach me after class, a breathless determination etched across her face as she asked if I would help her plan it. My instincts screamed at me that something was amiss. Rumors whispered through the halls, hints of troubles at home that not even I, the well-meaning teacher, could unravel fully, but I nodded, a slight encouragement at the corners of my mouth. I agreed to help with the decorations and even promised I'd talk to the administration about allowing her to use the school gym for the event. Yet, as the days turned into weeks and the excitement around her quince spiraled into something resembling fairy tale hype among the students, I couldn't shake the growing unease that shadowed my heart, fueled by encounters I had with her family's financial struggles. When Sophia, glowing and radiant, approached me the following week to finalize some of the plans, I hesitated, the weight of uncertainty clutching at my throat, and when I muttered that I wasn't sure if she could have the quince due to potential issues stemming from her family background, the air thickened, her smile faltered, the color drained from her cheeks like someone had pulled the plug on her dream. A stunned silence fell over the classroom, the other students leaning in, wide-eyed, and I tried to clarify myself, to retract my words, but the damage was done. She turned on her heel and fled, leaving behind an echo of disbelief. From that moment on, I felt a shift. The whispers grew louder, not just amongst the students, but I could feel the chastising stares of the faculty, their judgment as corrosive as acid, speculating if I crushed a girl's aspirations with a careless comment. Days slipped by in a haze of regret, Sophia avoiding my gaze, her laughter replaced with a sorrowful hush, and just when I thought I might make amends, I was hit with an email from the school's principal informing me that Sophia's family had withdrawn her from school, effective immediately. Panic clawed at my chest. I wanted to reach out, to apologize, to let her know I never meant to upset her, but the digital void was deafening, a complete stop to all communication, and I was left to wonder if my offhanded comment had spiraled into something far darker than I could comprehend, until one night, after tossing and turning under blankets of regret, I received a chilling email from Sophia herself. The subject line read simply, "You were right," and as I opened it, I felt ice peel back the layers of my guilt. The email revealed that her home life had grown increasingly chaotic, her family struggling with unseen demons, her father losing his job, the celebratory dresses replaced with hunger pangs, and buried within the paragraphs was something that made my heart lurch. She wrote of a plan to reclaim her narrative, to find hope amidst the shadows that threatened to consume her entire existence, and as I read her words, the line blurred between despair and resolve, making me question my my own role, my own cruel insensitivity, for I realized too late that my uncertainty had not only cast a cloud over her quinceañera but had transformed into something far more sinister. It had unwittingly exposed a fracture that ran deeper, something I never grasped until it was too late. The email concluded with just a single question: is there really a chance for me? The sorrow woven through her words struck me, coursed through my veins like a wildfire, igniting a desperation to reach out and guide her. But when I tried, my emails bounced back. Her family had severed all ties, pulling her from the world that had become too oppressive, too unforgiving, and it struck me like an axe splintering wood. My hope for her future had become twisted with every moment I'd let my doubts fester and grow, leaving me with a shrouded understanding in the silence that followed her departure. The echoes of laughter that once filled my classroom were replaced by an eerie stillness, and as I sat, the burden of guilt settling on my shoulders like a heavy coat, I couldn't help but wonder if I had not only become a stranger in her life but a ghost in my own, a cautionary tale of how a thoughtless remark, even in the name of caution, could chip away at the dreams of someone so young, trapped in the shadows of their own despair. All because I had been too afraid to believe in the chances that flickered like a distant candle, extinguished by my own doubts. Growing up, I always knew I was different from the other kids in my town. While most families seemed whole and uncomplicated, my reality was a patchwork quilt of half-truths and familial tensions, my parents' marriage a fragile thing that shattered when I was just 15. It was then that my mom revealed to me the existence of my half-sister, Lily, a product of my dad's affair, and though I initially felt a strange sort of sympathy for her, that empathy twisted and hardened as years went by. With my mother constantly torn between her loyalty to our bloodline and the shame her husband's infidelity brought upon us, she began to favor Lily, at least in the subtler, unmeasured ways: an extra scoop of ice cream at parties, bonus minutes spent in delighted conversation that I never seemed to earn. It came to a head when my mother decided to gift Lily our family's most prized heirloom, a delicate silver necklace adorned with a single emerald, which had belonged to my grandmother and was said to carry the blessings of strength and resilience. That summer evening, as I stood there aghast, Lily grinning in delighted astonishment while my heart pounded like a war drum echoing betrayal through my veins, I felt my chest constrict with such a mix of emotions: rage, contempt, and something jaggedly sharp that I'd only admit to myself years later, a deep, gnawing sense of loss. I told her she didn't deserve it, the words spilling out of my mouth like venom, and for a moment the air was thick with a silence that amplified the quiet sobs my mother stifled. In an instant, Lily's joy was crushed under the weight of my accusation, her face paling. "You don't even know me," she retorted, but the words cut deeper than any knife, and for a fleeting moment, I saw irritation fuse with sadness in her eyes. Everything spiraled after that. My mom refused to talk to me, her disappointment a tangible cloud that enveloped our home, wrapping itself so tightly around me that I suffocated in shame. I convinced myself I was right, that I was standing up for the sanctity of our family line, not to mention my grandmother's memory, but every day that dragged into weeks left a bitter residue on my soul, and Lily was the ghost haunting me wherever I went until one nameless, starlit night I found myself on my way to meet her, a stupid impulse driving me forward like a moth to a flame, thinking maybe, just maybe, I could mend the frayed edges of the relationship I sabotaged so recklessly. Lily lived in an old Victorian that smelled of mildew and neglect, her laughter once light-hearted now tinged with a hardness that spoke of years spent being a shadow, always outshined by a bone-deep allure of a necklace she knew would never belong to her. She opened the door with hesitation, and I noticed the way her eyes flickered with a cocktail of surprise and cautious hope. "What do you want?" she asked, but the sharpness of her tone melted the moment she caught sight of the little box I held closely, the very one my mother had used to gift her that damned necklace. "I'm sorry," I stuttered, feeling the weight of my words evaporate in the cool night air. "I wanted you to have it, because it's not the necklace that matters, it's what it represents, the love and connection that comes with it." Yet as I held out the small box, Lily's expression shifted, confusion wrinkles furrowing her brow. "You're just saying that because of Mom," she whispered, bitterness flowing through every syllable, making me realize how wrong I was to believe that a simple apology would eclipse the years of resentment we shared. But then, she surprised me, her eyes softening as she slowly reached for the box, delicate fingers trembling, and I felt a warm swell in my chest. For a moment, we exchanged something sacred, a flicker of that sisterly bond that had been buried in the rubble of our complicated heritage. But in the back of my mind, a plaguing thought lingered: what if the real ghost that was haunting me wasn't the fractured family ties but rather what lay inside that necklace box? As the night unfolded, and shadows danced across her living room, something broke in me when I finally said, "It's cursed." Lily laughed, a sound that echoed against the walls, disbelief sparkling in her eyes, but I persisted, recounting the whispers I'd heard, the warnings passed down through years, that the necklace held a dark secret. My grandmother had insisted on wearing it every single day until her last breath, her slow decline a shadowed testimony to its malevolence. That revelation hung in the air like a lightning storm, and I hoped the curse would shatter the moment, expose any fragile connection we had. But when Lily pulled the necklace from its velvet resting place, I swear I felt the temperature drop as darkness unfurled around us, an unsettling whisper brushing through the air, weaving itself through the tension. "You think I can't handle it?" she challenged, heart blazing with defiance, and my stomach dropped as I caught her twisting the delicate chain around her neck, the emerald glimmering ominously at the hollow of her throat. The lights flickered, shadows growing long and distorted, stretching across the room, and I felt as if I was standing at the edge of a precipice as dread unfurled like a storm. I approached her cautiously, my heart racing, assuring her it was just an old wives' tale, but the moment she pressed her fingertips against the cool emerald, my voice was drowned out by a rumble, the ground beneath us trembling. Suddenly, with a crash, the windows shattered violently, a gust of icy wind rushing in, a fury unleashed. I screamed for her to take it off, but she stood there, frozen, eyes wide with a mix of terror and exhilaration, a new kind of laughter spilling from her lips that sent chills down my spine. In that instant, I knew we were no longer searching for forgiveness, nor sisterhood, but rather that darkness was claiming her, just as it had claimed our grandmother. The necklace now tangled around her like a malevolent snake, it began to glow with an ethereal light, and as the horrifying truth dawned on me, I realized I didn't just destroy our family's legacy, I unleashed a haunting that neither of us could escape. It was too late for apologies now. With a heartbreaking resolve, I rushed towards her, desperate to rip it away, but unearthly sounds erupted from the shadows, screeching and wailing, a cacophony promising suffering, promising that we had both become part of something far beyond our understanding. The necklace glowed brighter, swallowing her whole as Lily screamed, an echo of anger, fear, and, above all, despair, before she simply vanished, the necklace spiraling into darkness as my heart shattered. I stumbled back, gasping, the world around me disassembling into chaos as I realized, the truth was never about deserving the necklace, it was about the curse that tethered us both to the ghosts of our past, and in my heart, I knew I would forever carry the weight of what happened that night, a sister still lost to the shadows, the necklace a constant reminder that in this twisted story, no one was truly innocent and I was left haunted by the question, AITA for telling my half-sister she didn't deserve my mom's necklace? I never thought I'd be the one caught in a tug-of-war over life and death, but when my father chose to prioritize his fiancée's surgery over my own, I couldn't help but feel like a ghost haunting the edges of his life. The moment I was diagnosed with a rare heart condition, everything spiraled from familiarity to sheer panic. My required surgery was life or death, an urgent fix to a ticking time bomb inside me. My dad, who had always been both my rock and my tormentor, became distant as soon as his new fiancée entered the picture, an almost cartoonish figure with a flashy smile and an obsession with yoga that somehow transformed my father from the caring dad I remembered into an oblivious shell wrapped around her every whim. I still remember the day it all shattered. I had been staring at the sterile hospital ceiling with its bright lights flickering like the last breaths of hope when my father strolled in, a confident grin plastered on his face, oblivious to the storm brewing in my chest. "Guess what?" he exclaimed, shattering my concentration. "Diane finally got the necessary approval for her surgery. It's next week." My heart raced, not from excitement, because I knew my surgery was also scheduled for next week, meant to save me from the darkness lurking within. I stared at him, mouth dry and words tangled in my throat, my mind racing with confusion and anger. "What about my surgery, Dad?" I asked, my voice a tremor against the cold efficiency of the room. All he could muster was a casual wave of his hand, a gesture that felt like a dismissive slap to my very existence. "Summer, sweetie, Diane needs this. It's a tough procedure, and I want to be there for her." At that moment, it dawned on me that I was no longer the priority in his life, his fiancée was the one who needed nurturing, love, attention, everything I had hoped my father would give me as I faced the specter of death. The reality hit me like 1,000 tiny hammers. He chose her over me, and I felt discarded, like a broken toy with no real value. I spent the days leading up to my surgery in limbo, wondering how blood could run thicker than water when mere affection had suddenly paled in comparison to a woman who gained my father's affection only recently. I didn't understand how he could be so blind, so utterly subsumed by her charm that he neglected the urgency of what was at stake, his own flesh and blood. On the day of the operation, nurses wheeled my gurney down the long, sterile hall, and as I passed the waiting area, I spotted him. He sat there, hand clasped over hers, laughing at something she said, laughing at the uncertainties of life, completely oblivious to my imminent fate. I felt my heart pounding in my chest, not with fear of the surgery but with rage and betrayal. They were just at the other end of the hallway, and as I was rolled on by, the moment felt like a goodbye, like I was surrendering myself to the uncertain void, pushed aside for someone who had only stepped into the picture months before. I woke up in recovery, groggy and disoriented, feeling as though I had been torn from one world and thrown into another. Dazed, I scanned the room, hoping against hope to see my dad. Instead, only an empty chair remained. I called out to a nurse, my voice cracking, feeling abandoned and lost, needing comfort, just wanting to know I mattered, that I was worth fighting for. She offered a sympathetic smile and squeezed my hand gently. "He's with Diane, dear, she had a complication in her procedure." Those words struck me like a thunderous drum, the realization that I could have been lying in a casket, my father by her side, his heart beating for her while mine lay cold. The pain morphed inside me, it was no longer just physical but a fiery bitterness. I didn't care how selfish I sounded, I was allowed to feel anger at the man who chose someone else over his own daughter. Days merged together, and every time I found the strength to look for my dad, he was still there with her, spinning tales of shared laughter while I lay bruised and silent in the hospital. When we finally spoke, I confronted him, my emotions overflowing like a flood, raw and unrestrained. "You chose her, Dad. You chose her over me," I said, tears streaming down my face. "You took her side, and I was alone." The silence that followed was the sharpest knife through my heart. A slow realization washed over him, but all I saw reflected back was disbelief. "No, it wasn't like that," he shouted, his voice thick with panic. "You're my daughter. You know that." But the words rang hollow, echoes drifting into the void where our bond had once thrived. I left the hospital feeling like I had lost more than my father. I had lost the last semblance of family I clung to, my will to fight diminished by someone who never cared to unravel the damage she had caused. Days turned into weeks, and news of Diane's shaky recovery filled my dad's voice every chance he got while still making excuses for his absence in my life. When I learned she was finally stabilized, I confronted my dad one last time. "You have to make a choice," I whispered, my heart racing as adrenaline coursed through me. "It's either me or her. You can't have both, not while I'm fighting for my life and she's taking everything from me." His face paled, and for the first time, I saw clarity in him, as if my words had finally threaded through the fog surrounding his mind. But instead of answering, he looked away, avoiding my gaze, and my heart shattered all over again. It was then I realized, the true betrayal wasn't his choice to love someone else, it was a choice he would always make, to love her more. Walking away from him that day felt like my own funeral, a weight lifting from my chest as I stepped into the cold air, a marionette severed from its strings. So, yeah, AITA for telling my dad he made a choice between me and his fiancée when he prioritized her surgery over mine? I don't think so. I just wanted him to see that he wasn't the only one who knew what it felt like to stand at the crossroads of life, and without him there to choose me, I simply had to learn to choose myself. It was a rainy Saturday morning, and the small coffee shop on the corner was packed, mirroring the storm outside with its chaotic energy. I managed to snag the last table, a tiny two-seater with a view of the dripping city streets, just as the door swung open to let in a gust of wind and a figure I would soon come to regret. She stumbled in, a wild-haired woman in a tattered raincoat, her face obscured by a tangle of frizzy curls, and for an instant, everything around me fell silent. She hovered in the doorway like some tragic specter. I caught a whiff of her as she approached the counter to order, and it hit me like a brick wall: sweat, rot and something I couldn't quite place, a medley of unkempt days stacked one atop the other like trash piling up in a back alley. I instinctively retracted my shoulders, suddenly hyper-aware of the people left standing in the queue, but they all wore expressions of discomfort, mirroring my own. Every instinct told me to maintain my distance. Her essence intruded upon the coffee shop's warm, cinnamon-tinged ambience. I was already watching people navigate between the tables, searching for a place to sit, and as I sipped cautiously on my overly sweet vanilla latte, I hoped she would find a corner where her smell wouldn't reach me. But life is never that simple. She approached my table, draped her coat over the back of the chair opposite me, and smiled a toothy grin that felt more like a warning than anything else. "Is this seat taken?" she chirped, and the pit in my stomach deepened as the aroma clung to the air around us, a thick, suffocating blanket that made my brain scream for escape. I wanted to be polite, to tell her I was waiting for someone, but the words caught in my throat, twisted by the harsh reality of her scent clinging to every surface. Instead, I cleared my throat, forcing a strained smile. "Actually, I'm just waiting for a friend," I replied, emphasizing the word friend like it was a sacred charm. She blinked and leaned in closer, the stench intensifying as if she had inhaled all the miseries of the world and exhaled them right in my direction. "Oh, come on, there's no need for that," she said, her voice a strange mix of persistence and desperation that instantly spat in the face of my discomfort. "It's a crowded place, just a quick sit until they find a seat." I felt my throat tighten further. I wanted to rise like a ghost, but the warmth of the latte paled in comparison to the cold, invading anxiety clawing at my chest. I could feel the eyes around us narrow in scrutiny, silently judging me, and I knew that I had to stand my ground because the alternative was unthinkable. I shook my head slowly, my pulse pounding in my ears. "I'm sorry, but I really can't. I need some space." The silence that followed felt heavy, as if the whole cafe held its breath, waiting for her reaction. Her expression shifted from surprise to something darker, a flicker of indignation igniting beneath the surface of her frazzled exterior. "You're really going to turn me away? Just because of how I smell?" she hissed, her voice dropping low yet piercing, echoing between tables, punctuated by the clinking of mugs and muted chatter that seemed to suddenly fade into mere background noise. My chest tightened, caught between a wave of guilt and the suffocating dread of being captured by her discomfort. I wanted to scream to the world that I wasn't the bad guy here, that this wasn't about her as a person, that my senses were fighting a losing battle against her reality. But it was too late. In her narrowed eyes, I saw the slow dawning realization that I might be one of the few people refusing to let her presence invade their space. She sat back, huffing, shoulders slumping, tail between her legs. I could tell she felt it, the weight of her own isolation, the lack of kindness in an unfriendly world, but I was drowning, gasping for clean air. That's when she leaned forward again, eyes alight with something indefinable, an unsettling spark swirling behind them. "You know, there's a name for people like you. They call you made of money and you turn your back on someone who just needs to rest. You won't remember this moment, you'll move on with your perfect, clean life while I'm left here in the dirt you won't even acknowledge." I braced myself for a possible outburst, but every moment of tension bent its spine back upon itself, wrapping the room in an atmosphere thick with anticipation. I wanted to hurl my guilt at her, to explain that I didn't have a perfect life, I had bills that made me sweat in my sleep and deadlines that haunted me. But her words cut deeper, and I found myself staring down into my latte, the froth swirling like crowded thoughts in my mind as shame crept over me like a thief in the night. "I'm not the bad guy here," I attempted to insist, voice trembling with uncertainty and helplessness, but I was drowning in her eyes, the raw emotion behind them flaying the fabric of my justification. Then, slowly, she straightened, mouth a thin line, and for a moment, I thought she might cry. Instead, she threw her head back and laughed. It wasn't the laughter of someone who found joy, it was the brittle kind that echoed of deep wounds and ancient hurts that made me wonder how often had she been ridiculed in this very way. Anger flared briefly at the edge of my thoughts, casting shadows of self-doubt into the void. Was I really the monster I'd been painted to be? The onlookers shifted in discomfort. It appeared to be a performance now, a spectator's sport of empathy versus survival. The barista even paused as she made cappuccinos, casting sideways glances at us as the mayhem unfolded. I wish I could have shrunk down into the woven fabric of the chair, to escape the twisted narrative taking form. "You know what," she said finally, a dangerous confidence threading her voice, "you might think you're better than me now, but if you saw what I saw, if you felt what I feel, you'd run screaming into the night." My stomach churned as her words slithered into my mind, sharp and sinuous, and I did not want to imagine. We were worlds apart, yet standing in the same coffee shop, and I wasn't proud of the thoughts rolling through my head, thoughts that toyed with my sanity, testing the limits of my own humanity. I could hear my heart pounding within the petrified silence, the air thick as if the rain outside had seeped into our souls. "Every interaction matters," she hissed, leaning closer still, unyielding. I held my breath, feeling myself unravel, wishing for the comfort of ignorance, and just when I thought it couldn't get worse, she added, "You think you understand what hell smells like, don't you?" The way she said it settled into my mind, twisting something deep inside me that tasted like regret and fear. I suddenly feared she could see through my facade, peel back my parameters and expose all that lay in ruin beneath. I was just about to protest, to shove her back into the abyss she claimed to know so intimately when, without a moment's warning, her left hand moved with precision to her coat pocket. Instinctually, I shrank back, my heart racing, wondering what she could possibly produce from that tangle of fabric. But then a glint caught the light, and in the size of an instant, I realized it was a small brass key, the kind you might find in an old hotel room. "You know, ever since I showed up, you have been hating this moment," she whispered fiercely. "But I could set you free, you know? I keep the worst of them at bay, all you have to do is ask." My gaze darted around the coffee shop, searching desperately for a sign of absurdity, for anyone to back me, but their eyes had diverted, and I was left tethered to this strange, grim pact looming at the fringes of sanity. "What are you talking about?" I challenged, although I sounded more confused than defiant. She leaned closer still, and I felt the unmistakable sting of desperation and danger weaving through the air. "I know people think I smell bad, but you don't understand. There are demons where you can't see, they cling to people who let them in. I've held them back. You don't have to live with that fear." I shook my head, shifting back in my chair, but she moved closer until her breath grazed my face. "Let me show you." I couldn't shake the sensation sprinting up my spine, her hand twitched like it was beckoning me to reach out. Then it was as if the world around us fell away, like I was in a dark vessel with no exit, feeling hovering eyes that weighed heavy upon my back. The scent, the woman, everything converged into a living nightmare before it struck me how wretchedly hopeless I felt. Was it wrong to reject her? Was I complicit in her suffering? The air was thick with a bittersweet kind of tension, like looking in the mirror and not recognizing who stared back. And in that fleeting moment, I could hear whispers creeping down the edges of reality, muddying the waters of my sanity. "You could run," she was saying, "but wouldn't you be curious? Wouldn't you want to know what you push away, what you so readily abandon in your comfortable life?" Every instinct screamed at me to say no, to refuse, to go back to my latte and the momentary safety of shallow pleasantries, but I felt something else kindle inside me. I leaned slightly closer, just a breath as I murmured, "What do I need to do?" The laughter returned, twisted and sharp, but then her expression shifted, and she froze, eyes glimmering with sanity and chaos interspersed. "Nothing, really. Just acknowledge what is around you. Just for one moment." And then in that celebrated whiplash, I gasped as she broke into a wide grin and suddenly the cafe fell silent. I twisted my head around like a puppet on strings to see what lay behind me, but there wasn't anything there, just the reflective glass that taunted my confusion. "Your demons are real, but they take many shapes," she continued, voice low and mesmerizing, and in that inward feeling, the vibrations of anxiety raced up my throat. The key suddenly felt immensely heavy in her hand, like it was holding a world I couldn't comprehend. "Acknowledge them, and you might find what really haunts you isn't me at all." And just like that, a shiver coursed up my spine, underlining the unsettling reality that perhaps I shouldn't have pushed her away, perhaps I would walk out of this coffee shop and carry her stench with me, her essence following, wrapped around my neck like a noose tightening with every breath. What turned from laughter shifted back to suspicion again, and the weight of the moment crashed down, but it was too late. I was scared, held captive by the disconcerting truth behind my own choices, and as the crowd connected with fleeting uncertainty, this woman, in her tattered raincoat, had opened the door to something buried deep within. Darkness doesn't require permission, it just waits in the shadows, waiting to devour you whole while you dismiss those looking for refuge, blurring the lines between safety and fear. I straightened, the coffee shop's familiarity almost gone, as her stormy eyes implored me to see beyond my aversion. And deep down, as the rain thrummed against the windows and people shifted in their chairs, I realized I might have made a choice in that moment, a choice that I would come to reckon with long after we parted ways. The coffee shop could never provide the safety I craved, only a fleeting mask over hidden truths. My heart raced in anticipation of what lay beyond, and I suddenly needed more than just my latte. I needed to discover the depths of those demons lurking just out of sight, ready to carve a path I wouldn't soon forget. I never thought a simple act of love would spiral into a nightmare, but here I am, trapped in a dark web of regret and horror. It all began when my daughter, Claire, who had been a vibrant light in my life, introduced me to her partner, Mia, and their gorgeous twin daughters, Lily and Rose. They were the kind of girls who left trails of glitter and laughter wherever they went, but with their busy lives and my own responsibilities, I felt that a handmade gesture would reconnect us all. So, I spent weeks sewing 2 cozy, colorful quilts adorned with intricate patterns of flowers and butterflies, one for each girl. The day I presented them, the delight in their eyes made every cut and stitch worth it, and at that moment, I basked in their joy, never knowing the darkness that lay ahead. It wasn't long after that, on a seemingly ordinary weekend, that strange things began to happen. It started when Lily fell ill with what Claire insisted was a common cold, but the next day, Rose also came down with the same symptoms. Then, a week later, Claire reached out to me in a panic. The girls had developed strange rashes on their arms and legs that seemed to flare up after curling up under the very quilts I had made. I felt a prick of unease, but I dismissed it, thinking it must have been an adverse reaction to the fabric I had used. "They'll be fine," I reassured her, though my heart was pounding as I hung up the phone. Then, more disturbing occurrences began to pile up. The family's cat, a fluffy tabby named Muffin, went missing, and one night I distinctly heard hushed voices coming from the girls' room. Concerned, I knocked, and Claire opened the door just enough to peek through, her face as pale as the moonlight illuminating the hallway. I could see the girls huddled under the blankets, whispering, but not talking to anyone as I recognized, perhaps playing some innocent game. Yet their giggles seemed unnaturally high-pitched and echoed unsettlingly in my ears. I brushed it off as growing pains of parenthood and carried on, crafting more quilts to send their way in a futile attempt to brush the darkness away. That wrong turn led me down a path of disbelief when one evening, as I looked through my sewing supplies, I stumbled upon something horrifying, tiny strips of fabric that looked almost like hair. Horrified, I collapsed into a parent's worst nightmare. The girls weren't just playing, they were weaving something darker than I could fathom. I found myself waking up in cold sweats, the images of my beloved grandchildren flickering in flame-like visions, the sound of their laughter turning into shrill screams. Barely sleeping, I found myself almost instinctively checking in on them more often, but each visit felt more shadowy than the last. One Friday night, driven by an unfathomable pull, I decided to follow those haunting whispers. It led me to the door of their room once more, but this time something shifted in me. Instead of fear, a deep curiosity consumed me. Peeking through the crack made my breath hitch. The girls were seated cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by a circle of candles illuminating a strange symbol drawn in chalk. Before them lay the quilts, their colors appearing almost too vibrant, too alive, and they were using them as an altar of sorts. I opened the door wider, my heart hammering, to find the girls chanting in a language I couldn't comprehend, their innocent faces now twisted into something unsettling, eyes too old for their little bodies, gleaming with a hunger I had never seen before. They turned to me in unison and smiled, revealing teeth that glinted unnaturally in the candlelight. "Join us, Grandma," they chimed, voices thick with something unnameable. I didn't know what to do. Every maternal instinct screamed for me to pull them away from whatever malevolence they were dabbling in. Yet another part of me, perhaps the deeper, darker part, was both terrified and fascinated. I backed away, closing the door quietly, wanting to give them space while also terrified for their safety. I tried calling Claire, but my hands shook too violently to dial correctly as dread choked me. The following week spiraled out of control. The more I tried to distance myself from the girls, the more the dark energy seemed to repulse me. It became evident to me that their rashes had worsened, and I saw a subtle change in Claire too: tangled hair, dark circles under her eyes, a sense of fatigue that aged her rapidly. When I finally managed to pry it from her lips, Claire admitted the girls had started talking about the night of offerings and other strange rituals, things that had no place in a child's imagination, and I felt faint. Panic surged through my veins. I needed to act before it spiraled completely out of control, but every time I tried to confront Mia and Claire, they brushed it off as just childhood imagination, but as their grandmother, I couldn't shake that feeling. I snuck around their house one night while they were out, trying to gather anything unusual. In the attic, buried beneath old toys, I found a tattered book filled with illustrations of symbols and relentless incantations. I flipped through it, confusion giving way to horror as the truth struck me: a dark lineage, a twisted legacy that my family seemed to have avoided, but now threatened to awaken with my innocent gestures of love. I ripped the book shut and stumbled out of the house, barely breathing, feeling the weight of my actions suffocate me. The quilting I thought would bind our family together was pulling me into something far more sinister. A choice had to be made. I began to cut ties, slowly withdrawing from their lives, desperate to protect my own sanity, but the girls grew more insistent, more invasive, as if sensing my fear and reluctance. At a family gathering later, I watched them closely. Something shifted in me when Rose smiled at me, a smile that seemed almost predatory. I felt as though she knew the truth of my cowardice. When I could take it no longer, I gathered everyone and blurted out all I had found, all that I had deciphered from the tattered book. Instead of disbelief, their laughter filled the air again, but it felt different, sharp and menacing. "It's not a game, Grandma," they said in unison, voices layered with something vile that chilled my very spirit. It was too late, I couldn't escape this. As Claire and Mia exchanged glances filled with acknowledgement, my heart sank. "You made a mistake," Claire said, and I felt my pulse quicken. I thought about the blankets, the love I had poured into those quilts, and it hit me, the offerings they spoke of were not mere children's games, and now I knew I was not just the innocent grandmother in this twisted tale. I had woven my own entrapment with every stitch and thread. I looked into the girls' eyes, shivers racing down my spine, realizing that they had drawn me into their machinations far deeper than I dared to believe, and it was there, nestled inside those blankets, where the true monstrosity lay waiting for the moment they decided to claim it. "So," I ask again, "AITA for making my lesbian daughter's children blankets?" I always thought the engagement ring my grandmother bequeathed to me was just a family heirloom, sparkling with history and nostalgic whispers of love, but ever since her funeral, it transformed into something else entirely, something sinister. When she passed away, my mother sobbed uncontrollably, clutching at her heart as if it might burst from grief. Amidst the echoes of mourning, I received the delicate ring, an intricate weave of gold, encrusted with a single brilliant diamond that seemed to pulse with a heartbeat of its own under the flickering chapel lights. For days, I kept it hidden in a small velvet pouch in my drawer, overwhelmed by not just the weight of loss, but the sense of obligation that accompanied such a treasured legacy. My mother, however, started dropping hints about how it rightfully belonged to her, how it was part of our family's bloodline, and how I shouldn't keep it for myself. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the ring was meant for me, and the fiery tug-of-war between familial loyalty and personal desire only intensified when I put it on. I swear I could hear my grandmother's voice whispering to me in the silence of my lonely room, coaxing me to protect it, to honor it. Then, the odd things began to happen. Shadows stretched across my walls, dark fingers creeping along the edges of my vision when I was alone at night, and every time I caught a glance of my reflection while wearing the ring, I felt a stranger staring back at me, but with my grandmother's warm smile creeping into her lips. My mother grew more frantic, restless, even desperate, and I began to piece together a darker story, one where the ring was a vessel for my grandmother's spirit, fiercely protective and unyielding. A week later, in a feverish dream, I found myself sitting at an enormous old table surrounded by flickering candles. My grandmother sat across from me, her smile soothing yet demanding. "This is your responsibility now," she said, her voice echoing off the walls like a forgotten lullaby, and even in the dream realm, I could feel the weight of that responsibility pressing against my chest. I woke up sweating, the ring still settling into the cool, clammy skin of my finger, a reminder that whatever this was, it flowed far deeper than a mere inheritance. It was legacy, it was obligation, it was power. My mother, however, had a darker intention. She wasn't just mourning, she was scheming, obsessively trying to reclaim the ring as if snuffing out my claim would sever some invisible link to our family's history. Anxiety gripped me, twisting my thoughts into frenzied knots. Who did I trust? Weeks dragged on, and I felt the shadow of my grandmother's spirit wrapping tighter around me as whispers morphed into bolder calls for protection. One night, she was more vivid than ever, her voice an intoxicating melody laced with urgency. "It's not safe anymore," she warned, making me question what I'd stumbled into. Paranoid and restless, I began to notice my mother getting darker, her mood shifting inconsistently like a thunderstorm churning in the distance, and the way she looked at me began to shift, from concern to an unsettling intensity that made cold trickles dance down my spine. I told her I would not give back the ring, and the clash between us felt like a rift splitting through the very fabric of our family. It was on that night, amid the hazy air of our argument, that the electrical hum of energy crackled, and the lights flickered as if my grandmother's spirit was the very essence fueling the atmosphere. My mother's voice darkened, exposing a bitter undercurrent intertwined with anger and sorrow, revealing that she believed I was chosen to carry a curse rather than a blessing. A bone-chilling laugh erupted from her throat, twisting my insides into knots, an echo I'd never encountered before. That night, sleep was a distant memory as dread gnawed at my gut, yet finally, exhausted and restless, I slipped into slumber sometime after dawn, prompting my mind to play tricks on me as I entered a world where the walls swirled like shadows. My dreams morphed, becoming grotesque and vivid, filled with whispers like a low hum echoing around a cavernous chamber, the very essence of my grandmother enveloping me, melding past and future. I saw visions of my mother, filled with rage and desperation, lunging for the ring that sat snugly on my finger, and with each harrowing vision, the weight of her fury clawed at my insides. When morning finally arrived, a surge of dread spiraled down my spine, pushing me to confront the reality that lay ahead. I ventured downstairs only to find the house still as a grave, and the air felt thick with an unsettling tension, the remnants of the argument hanging heavy like fog. I reached for the delicate ring only to find it had vanished from my nightstand, and panic gripped me. Where could it be? My heart thudded violently as I trudged through the house, searching high and low until I stumbled into my mother's dimly lit study. In the center of the room stood my mother, clutching the ring with feather-light fingers, a manic glimmer alight in her eyes that sent my heart racing and my defenses rising. "You don't understand, do you?" she hissed, her voice woven with a cunning that chilled my bones. I was taken aback, every part of me screamed to reclaim what was rightfully mine, but the air between us crackled with an energy that felt almost ancient. Within her eyes, I glimpsed something dark, and suddenly the realization hit, and I understood the truth. It was more than just a ring, it was a battleground for our grandmother's spirit, a catalyst seeking to protect what once was, sparring between desire and duty, life and death. But before I could grasp the weight of that revelation, my mother raised her hands, clutching the ring like a talisman, refusing to accept its rightful fate. In that moment, the temperature in the room plunged, and a shadow loomed behind her, clearer than day. It was my grandmother, her face twisted in indignation, furious that we were tearing ourselves apart over something that was supposed to symbolize love. Everything spiraled out of control in that tense standoff, voices growing louder, breaths quickening, and as my mother let out a primal scream, the ring began to tremble as the spectral figure flared to life, her voice deafening, filled with a tidal wave of anguish and fury. "Release it to the one who knows the truth. It was never yours to take," she declared, and just like that, amidst a whirlwind of emotions, the house began to shake violently, glasses shattering while chaos reigned, leaving me standing there, the weight of decision crashing down like a tidal wave, because in that moment, I realized it wasn't about giving back the ring, it was about reclaiming the love it represented and making a choice. So no, I didn't give back the engagement ring. I chose to embrace the echoes of my family's love, to acknowledge what my grandmother whispered through the void, where grief and fear dance hand in hand. And eventually, it became clear, some inheritances are a burden, but they also shine a profound light on who we choose to become amid the chaos, though the shadows still linger, and I wonder if the whispers will ever truly fade. When I married Derek, I knew right from the start that I'd have to navigate the murky waters of his past. After all, his ex-wife, Lisa, hadn't just exited his life like some forgettable chapter. She was a ghost that lingered in every conversation, in the decorations of our shared home that sometimes felt like borrowed nostalgia, and most importantly, in the shadow of her new wife, Anna, who, as odds would have it, turned out to be someone who had an unsettling tendency to insert herself into our lives. It all came to a head one gloomy afternoon in early November, when Derek and I had just settled into our weekend routine of lazy brunch and Netflix. My phone buzzed with a message from Lisa, and I braced myself for the usual pleasantries, some innocent inquiry about the kids, maybe, but as I opened the text, I found Anna's name splattered across the screen. "I heard you don't want to meet me." "That's okay, I understand your feelings." It rattled me, and I tried to shove the inexplicable anxiety down, telling myself it was merely a misguided attempt at something resembling friendship. The truth was, the more I read about Anna, the new wife in a life that should have been severed from Derek but wasn't, the more I could feel the small hairs on the back of my neck prickle, sharper than any ghost's whisper, and it wasn't long before my polite refusals morphed into something darker. I told Derek I didn't want to meet her. He frowned as if he was about to argue, and years of marital negotiations played out in my mind, but thankfully, he kept his mouth shut, a shift I accepted, thinking perhaps he was on my side after all, until one fateful Friday night when the walls felt too thin and the shadows seemed to breathe. I woke in the middle of the night to a banging sound, loud and urgent, enough to rattle the very foundations of our home, but panic surged through me when I realized the noise was coming from the back door, where our kitchen met the dim alley behind our condo. I grabbed my phone and crept toward the sound, heart hammering in my chest, but just as I reached for the door, a figure darted into the darkness, a fleeting glimpse that caught my breath, Anna, standing there for just a second before vanishing into the abyss, and I swore I could taste her defiance in the air, a bitter tang tinged with a sense of ownership that made me feel as if she was daring me to come out and play. All the warning bells were clanging in my mind. One moment, I felt frozen, and in the next, I was racing back to my bedroom, where Derek slept soundly, blessedly unaware of the chaos of women that seemed determined to ruin our lives. Days passed in a surreal blur, where Anna's shadow loomed larger, and I came to know my own home as a battlefield. I began to hear whispers when no one was around, felt prying eyes watching through curtains when the sun went down, and every so often, I'd catch sight of a figure disappearing into the corner of my vision in the dimly lit spaces of our life. It got to the point of paranoia. I convinced myself Anna was playing some cruel game, trying to push me into a confrontation that, for her, would be thrilling, as if my refusal to engage with her was some sort of challenge she was determined to win. I lashed out at Derek more than ever, accusing him of being too close to his past, a ghost silently haunting our house even during daylight hours. But as it often goes in life, I soon learned that my sleepless nights came at a cost. One rainy afternoon, I received a surprise visit from Derek's sister, Rachel, well-intentioned, but her chatter about family gatherings, during which Anna had been graciously invited, felt sharp, like a knife twisting in my gut. It was on the tip of my tongue to unleash the devils I'd been keeping close, but I bit down murkily, burying my grievances underneath polite smiles, and yet my mind wandered back to Anna, worrying and careful like a spider spinning a web that seemed to ensnare us all in its delicate but unforgiving threads. When I finally reached my breaking point, it was during a dinner party, where the corny ambience of laughter and clinking glasses masked the war raging in my heart. Derek's family, including Lisa, stood in our backyard under twinkling fairy lights, and as if summoned by dark magic, Anna appeared, lovely in an ethereal way that cut into my self-worth like a knife. She greeted everyone breezily, and the taunting gleam in her eyes while she exchanged pleasantries with Derek felt like high stakes. Couldn't they see that she was here to replace me? That I would ultimately become just another piece in a twisted puzzle built on miscommunication and misunderstanding? As I stepped outside, my heart raced cold in my chest. I realized something had to give. In the very first moment I tried to confront her, adrenaline coursing through my veins, things spiraled faster than I could comprehend. "I don't want to talk to you," I asserted a bit too loudly, well aware that the party had all but faded into the background of our confrontation, glances darting between us as if we were the main event. But Anna just laughed lightly, brushing her hair back and holding my gaze with a fierce confidence that knocked wind out of me. "Why do you refuse? You don't have to be so afraid, you know. There's enough room in this life for all of us." Those words hung in the air like a curse, and an inexplicable dread gripped me, transforming my knees into gelatin. My refusal solidified into some sickening reality, that I was terrified, yes, terrified of this woman, this specter of Derek's past and the embodiment of a person who wouldn't just let go. She wanted to stake her claim, and here I was on trial for an invisible crime, sentenced simply for existing next to a ghost. Their laughter felt like a mocking eulogy to a life I had desperately tried to forge, and the air turned thick with tension, so palpable that I could likely cut it with a butcher's knife. It overwhelmed me until the needs for confrontation morphed into something twisted, darker. I wasn't just refusing to meet her, I was staring into a chasm, both terrified and intoxicated by the possibility of falling right in, resisting the call of something sinister I couldn't articulate. And then, just like that, it happened. The lights flickered overhead, plunging us into a surreal dance of shadows before a brilliant flash of lightning illuminated Anna's face, and in that single flicker, her grin twisted into something malicious, the kind that made my heart pound. The conversation fell silent, as if the world could feel the tremor of impending doom, and in that moment, I knew something in me snapped. I couldn't just refuse to acknowledge her anymore. The fear that had been simmering transformed into sheer defiance, something wild and unrestrained. With a smirk, I stepped forward into the abyss, ready to confront the specter that had taken over my life, but the response from Anna was chilling. She took a step back, eyes wide and retreating. It was then I realized I'd become more than just a new player in a game of old lovers. I'd become something darker, something powerful that didn't intend to share. In that strange moment of clarity, with my newfound conviction, I finally understood the horror that wasn't found within Anna's taunts or sneers, but within my own reflection warped within a fragmented mirror of shared pasts and futures. I was battling not just for myself, but for Derek, and the life we had built, and as Anna retreated under the gaze of our onlookers, I couldn't help but wonder, was I really prepared for what I had awakened? What dark consequences awaited us all? The space shimmered with unspoken words and unresolved fears, each person witnessing the birth of a new tension, and amidst it all, that question echoed endlessly in my mind, AITA for refusing to talk to my husband's ex-wife's wife? But truthfully, maybe it was time to discover what lay beneath the surface, to revisit every last secret buried in the darkness that would ultimately either free us or consume us. I never thought my life would take the turn it did that fateful evening when I decided to clear out our daughter's bedroom. I stood in the doorway, heart racing, staring at the colorful walls plastered with unicorn stickers that she loved so much, a room frozen in her laughter and brightness, but now haunted by my husband's betrayal, a betrayal I had stumbled upon just weeks before, his late-night texts, his reckless disregard for our family, and the undeniable evidence of an affair that birthed a child they never intended for me to know. But I knew everything. Still, those long sleepless nights consisted of perfecting my revenge, and the twisted sense of justice motivated me to pack up her life as if I was merely returning a borrowed possession to a long-lost friend. I remembered the day she was born, how I had cradled her tiny body in my arms, promising her eternal love and protection, and suddenly, I felt this primal urge to shield her from the disgrace of her father's actions, and so that night, I made the trek to the attic and retrieved the boxes marked with her name, stuffed animals, art supplies, those crayon-drawn pictures that once adorned our fridge, items that brought joy now felt like reminders of her father's betrayal. I marched to her room, emptying shelves, packing them meticulously, as if with every toy I stuffed into the box I could erase the memories of his infidelity, feelings of rage coursing through my veins as I imagined his other child, the one from the affair, unpacking her things in my sacred space, living a life in our home where my daughter's spirit once thrived. How dare he think he could bring that child into our world as though nothing had changed? I loaded my car with the boxes that night, my heart pounding, the weight of my decision clinging to my chest. The thought of her father coming home to find nothing but stark walls staring back at him was too delicious to resist. I drove to my parents' house, a place where I had grown up, their cozy warmth suffocating me in nostalgia as I lugged in the boxes, determined to secure a part of my daughter's happiness where no one could touch it, wrapping it in the safe confines of love, and calling my parents to let them know the crazy plan I was enacting. They were concerned but ultimately supportive, especially after hearing the tremor of betrayal in my voice, the elements of sadness seeping through the cracks of my resolve. The weeks that followed were restless, amplifying my anxiety when I finally decided to confront him. His apologies rang hollow as he described how life just happened, and the words tore through me, shattered glass echoing in the vacant spaces of my heart. I could feel the cracks form as he pleaded with me to just give everything a second chance, to welcome him back into my arms and our daughter's life, an opportunity I knew I could never grant. Instead, I threw the boxes down around him, each one thudding against the floor with the weight of our broken dreams, hexing him with my furious stare. I told him I'd already done the heavy lifting. He would have nothing left of her, nothing left of peace for the child that had stolen my life. He gasped, his face morphing into disbelief, anger bubbling within those hazel eyes I once loved. But I felt a strange sense of satisfaction as I hung up the phone after declaring it was done, a calm overtaking me as I drove back to my parents' place to tuck my daughter into bed. And the next day, I received a call that turned my world further upside down. A mixture of disdain and pity filled my stomach as I learned about his plans to contest the arrangement, claiming that I was being unreasonable, uprooting her life further into chaos, twisting my act as malice rather than a mother's attempt to protect the sanctity that remained of our family. A loaded gun and a duel awaited. The stakes were high as whispers of the affair child began surfacing. Drama unfolding in circles I never intended to find myself in, my small town filled with scrutiny and judgment as I became the center of attention. The child was so innocent, I understood, but the way my husband was telling the story twisted everything about who I was. I was the villain now, the sinner who sought revenge on a child who knew nothing, and yet, I was right. It was an emotional roller coaster that left my heart wearied and precariously balanced as I battled courts for custody, justified my choices in front of their distorted glares, and braced for the war that would ensue when the affair child's mother decided to step forward, her blood-curdling screams echoing in the depths of my mind when she confronted me about taking their belongings, accusing me of silently cruel intentions as if I was the one who betrayed, as if I pulled the trigger first. It was easy to hate her as she bounced behind the emotions of being denied happiness, as I reminded myself she chose this life. While I had committed to hours, but things began to change when I heard my daughter whisper hauntedly through the air while she played with friends, "Is my room still there?" Maybe the futility of my actions were now painful in ways I hadn't anticipated as I realized I wasn't only uprooting my husband and the child he sired, but I was silently ripping apart my little girl's foundation, and that thought dug in. So a week passed, and I stood at my former home, staring at the pallid door, and my heart cracked open even wider. I bellowed open the front door, the darkness of the hallway overwhelmed me, and there it was, that echo of laughter carried down the walls, but no longer were they filled with her joy. My heart raced as I ventured past the living room to vanish into my daughter's realm of colors, and in that instant, I felt like a ghost. The furniture moved around so starkly it was as if I could feel nothing but despair seeping through the cracks, and what awaited was a mere glimpse of those toys that I had left behind. They remained discarded, callously tossed without care, and the sheer thought of my daughter being replaced by a child who should have never existed in this place stirred something inside me. It hit me then. I wasn't making a point, I was simply hurting an innocent. When I first moved into my tiny 2-bedroom apartment with Clara, I was excited to finally have a place of my own, an escape from the oppressive atmosphere of my childhood home. Clara was friendly and welcoming, and we bonded over our shared love of late-night baking marathons and binge-watching true crime documentaries. Everything was great until one evening, when I got home late after a long shift at the diner and decided to whip up a batch of cookies to unwind. The smell of chocolate chip dough rising in the oven felt like home, familiar and comforting, but just as I pulled the tray out, Clara's voice cut through the sweetness of the moment. "Can we talk?" she asked, her expression serious, which struck me as odd. I set the warm cookies on the cooling rack and sat down at the small kitchen table, eager to hear what was bothering her. Clara lowered her voice, as if someone might overhear us, and said, "I need you to promise me you won't use the oven again." My heart dropped, the request clawed at my mind, a bone-chilling whisper of unreasonableness. "What? Why?" I asked, incredulous. You just can't," she insisted, her voice trembling slightly. Every fiber of my being wanted to dismiss her, but my curiosity got the better of me. "Is this about your weird family back home?" I pressed, remembering the odd traits she'd shared, like her great-grandfather's obsession with farming the land even after moving to the city. Clara's gaze suddenly turned distant, like a clock unwinding. "It's for your own good," she said quietly, and that's when I noticed how her hands were clenched into tight fists, her knuckles white against the faded oak of the table. I tried to reason with her, tell her that in all my previous apartments, I'd always used the oven, it was essential, the heart of my culinary dreams. But Clara remained firm, almost fearful. So, night after night, I reluctantly complied. My meals became monotonous, leaning heavily toward microwave dinners and takeout, leaving the oven untouched and the rich aroma of baked goods locked away in my yearning heart. I could feel the tension building, so I decided to do some digging and looked through the boxes Clara had left unpacked since the move. I found an old, dust-covered cookbook bound in frayed leather that caught my attention, dog-eared and marked with strange symbols I didn't recognize. Flicking through pages, I discovered handwritten notes in a hurried scrawl that spoke of rituals, of family traditions lost to time, and warnings against the oven being a portal of sorts, a gateway for something sinister. That night, I tentatively approached Clara as she flicked through channels, eyes glazed, and asked her about the cookbook. Her face turned pale, she snatched it from my hands, growling, "You shouldn't have looked at that." I recoiled, and she suppressed a sob as if she were about to spill secrets wrought with anguish. "What is happening, Clara?" I urged, but she shook her head in the manner of a child being lectured, whispering about how the oven shouldn't be used, how it belonged to a legacy far darker than we could comprehend. As the days dragged on, wrapped in her escalating mania, I finally lost my patience. It was a Thursday night, and I needed to bake something, anything, to reclaim my sanity. I woke up in the dead of night with an insatiable hunger for something freshly baked. Quietly, I crept into the kitchen, adrenaline coursing through my veins, and leaned over the counter where my food scale and mixing bowls lay patiently. Ignoring my better judgment, I started to gather my ingredients. I turned the oven knob, feeling a sense of rebellion surge through me, and that beautiful glow flickered to life, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. As I mixed together the batter, I could have sworn I heard something in the distance, a whisper echoing from deep within that old cookbook. The moment my cookies started to brown, the shelves rattled under an invisible force. Confusion flooded my senses, maybe it was an earthquake, or perhaps Clara had returned. But as I peeked through the window into the deep ink of midnight, I saw her. She was standing in the darkness of the courtyard, her back to me, whispering in a language that was sharp and foreign. I felt the door swing open behind me, a gust of wind that carried Clara's scent, something floral yet cold, like autumn leaves. I spun around, heart pounding, only to find the oven door flung wide open, steam billowing out like ethereal smoke. As I leaned forward, horrified, I noticed that my beautifully baked cookies had transformed into grotesque, burnt shapes, almost as though they were alive, broken shells shrieking silently in my mind. A low growl reverberated from the oven, the temperature surged, and the shadows coalesced into a swirling mass. The realization hit me swiftly. Clara had been keeping me from using the oven for a reason, a warning cloaked in paranoia. I reached for the cookbook, my fingers trembling, but Clara appeared behind me, her face twisted, fury and sorrow etched into her features. "You weren't supposed to see," she shrieked, and as I turned, the shadows seemed to reach out, lunging toward her. She stumbled backward, nails clawing at the wooden floor, a scream pouring from her lips as the darkness enveloped her. I was frozen in shock as she was dragged into the abyss of the oven, the growls intensifying, final echoes of her terror haunting the air. I blinked and found myself alone, the kitchen illuminated eerily by the oven's light. The cookbook lay open on the table, words shifting like quicksand, warning me, never again. My heart raced as a burning rage ignited within me. Yet, the overwhelming dread remained. I staggered back, staring at the melted remnants of the cookies that felt like pieces of souls. I stumbled out of the kitchen, breath quickening, feeling Clara's absence like a chasm in my chest. I don't think I will ever truly understand what happened that night. Days passed, and I couldn't bring myself to open the oven again. I lived off cold meals, the silence echoing in the apartment, and every time I caught a glimpse of the cookbook, its call now tainted with dread, I felt a presence lurking within its pages. I've tried to move on, but whispers follow me, warning me that the oven's portal is still alive, a void waiting to swallow more. Now, every time I hear a knock on my door or see a shadow dart in the corner of my eye, I can't help but wonder if Clara is still out there. I still hear her voice sometimes, calling softly, begging for help against the darkness, a darkness I helped unleash by breaking a promise. So, here I am, AITA for wanting to use the oven, or is she still watching from whatever realm those shadows had taken her to, forever reminding me of what the oven truly holds? I need to share something that happened to me recently, and let me tell you, it's been haunting me ever since. I, 24, male, was living with my roommate, Sarah, 22, female, in an apartment that came with limited parking spaces, so we both had a parking pass we needed to display to keep our vehicles safe from being towed. Now, at first, everything seemed fine, but it didn't take long for Sarah's behavior to change. Picture this, every night she'd come home late, sometimes after midnight, after what she said were long shifts at her second job, which I didn't mind until I started noticing that she was leaving her car parked without the pass displayed, even though I'd reminded her at least a dozen times. The first time I noticed it, I told her to park in our designated spot and put the pass up. She waved me off, claiming she would handle it, but as weeks turned into months, the same pattern played out. Her car would sit there, vulnerable and ominously unchecked. I think deep down I knew that ignoring the rules and parking without a pass was what made her feel rebellious, but the threat of a tow loomed over both our heads, and I started to get anxious every time I saw her vehicle in its usual spot without the pass, yet when I confronted her, she'd brush me off like I was the unreasonable one. It escalated the night I saw a tow truck pulling into the lot. It was like watching a slow-motion train wreck. I could see the driver scanning for offenders, and a chill ran down my spine as I stepped into the hallway. I had a choice to make. I won't lie, I mentally calculated the consequences for both of us, lose her car or confront her again, but knowing Sarah, I could picture her obnoxious eye rolling every time I brought it up, so in that moment, I made the decision. I followed that tow truck. Through the glass door, I watched as they got out and approached her car. My heart raced as I jogged down the stairs, desperate to stop them, but it was already too late. They had it lifted off the ground, and in that moment, I felt a pitiful mix of satisfaction and impending regret. I'd done what I thought was right, but the backlash I anticipated didn't take long to arrive. The next morning, I woke up to find Sarah standing over me, her face pale with anger, and she wasted no time accusing me of being the sole reason her car was gone. I tried to explain how many times I had warned her, how this was purely a consequence of her choices, but she kept accusing me of sabotaging her life and ruining her independence. She even went as far as saying I was taking pleasure in her misfortune. I told her that if she had just followed the rules, we wouldn't be here. That evening, her attempts at getting her car back only compounded her frustration when she learned that her parking pass had been revoked as well. In her fury, she vowed to make my life miserable, and I didn't take her seriously until the creepy stuff started happening. She'd come home late and drop heavy items on the floor to wake me up, blasting music with absurdly loud bass to keep me from sleeping, and I'd find my refrigerator contents rearranged or the dishes dirty when I'd cleaned them just the day before. I thought I was being paranoid until one night, while I was curled up trying to block out the noise with my headphones, I heard her whispering outside my door, saying my name in this eerie sing-song voice that sent chills through my spine. It was as if she was summoning something sinister. I confronted her about it, but she just laughed, saying she was testing my sanity. That was when I began noticing odd occurrences. One of my PS4 games went missing, only to later appear in her room, and when I asked her what it was doing there, she merely shrugged and claimed it found its way. Friends on social media started checking in on me, asking why I looked so tired all the time, and I eventually began sleeping at a friend's house after noticing that she would watch me while I slept, her eyes glimmering strangely in the darkness. I figured I would come clean to anyone that would listen about the awful situation, but my friends thought I was the weird one. I felt isolated, trapped in an apartment that now seemed haunted by her twisted perspective. The turning point came weeks later when I found out that an old mutual friend of ours went missing after reaching out to Sarah, claiming they needed to talk. I immediately tried to talk to her about it, but she just dismissed my concerns, telling me it had nothing to do with her. It was then, in a panic, I decided to check her texts and discovered that she had sent cryptic messages about someone transcending and being free along with a strange timestamp that mirrored the night my friend disappeared. My gut told me something sinister had happened, but the moment she caught me snooping, it was like unleashing Pandora's box. The next day, I woke up to find my belongings trashed. Somehow she snuck in during the night, and I panicked. I grabbed my phone to call the police, but the battery was dead. My heart thudded in my chest as I realized it was only a matter of time before she would come back, and based on what I saw in her texts, I knew I had to escape before my life turned into a living nightmare. The following night, I snuck out, clutching a single duffel bag, but when I reached the parking lot, I was greeted by the harrowing sight of her car parked, with the driver's seat illuminated, even though this time she was nowhere to be seen. I hesitated, but the only way I knew I could protect myself was to leave, so I bolted to my car, only to be peppered by a deafening laughter echoing back from the direction of the apartment. Never have I felt terror like that, knotting through my stomach as I drove through the night, and even now, weeks later, I keep looking over my shoulder, paranoid that she followed me or that somehow, I've let something dark linger, but I still wonder if I went too far by getting her car towed, regardless of whatever captivating madness her psyche had devolved into, and the looming question remains, was I the villain in this twisted tale, or just a victim entangled in a nightmare? When my fiancé, Tom, and I decided to move into our first home together, I imagined the smiles, laughter, and warmth we would fill it with, but everything changed the day I voiced my concern about his cousin's girlfriend, Clara. Clara had always rubbed me the wrong way, her laughter too loud, her words too cutting, and one particularly unsettling memory of a family barbecue haunted me. She cornered me, her cold eyes glinting with mischief, and whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear, about my past struggles with anxiety, painting me as some fragile, broken person. I brushed it off back then. Family dynamics can be complex, and feigned a smile while the red crept up my neck. But as moving day approached, I felt a creeping dread about the idea of her plopping on our new couch, treating our space like her personal stage. So, in an attempt to safeguard our peace, I brought it up to Tom, explaining how uncomfortable it made me to think she'd feel entitled to our home, that I just didn't want her to bring her drama and condescension into this new chapter of our lives. To my shock, he looked at me like I'd slapped him, his brows knitted in confusion, as he insisted that family gatherings were meant to be inclusive, and Clara was part of that family, and somehow it spiraled into a heated argument where he accused me of being controlling, selfish, not understanding the importance of his family to him, and in that moment, I felt the weight of isolation as he doubled down on inviting her, claiming I was overreacting, that I was the one causing a rift between us. I found myself in the eye of a storm I couldn't comprehend, where my feelings meant nothing, and he chose blood over the woman he was supposed to love most. It shattered me, and I felt like a villain in my own life, a true the fiancé versus the cousin's girlfriend tale playing out in a twisted sense of irony, and I thought of the odd glances she wouldn't hesitate to throw at me whenever Tom wasn't around, her calculated remarks piercing like daggers, but I kept quiet. When moving day arrived, the last thing I wanted was conflict, so I plastered on a smile and welcomed the chaos that came with a dozen family members stepping over boxes and trailing dirt onto our floors, but deep down I could feel that storm brewing. I'd already warned Tom, hadn't I? As the day unfolded, the house buzzed with laughter and chatter, and amidst the crowded living space, there appeared Clara, strutting in like she owned the place, her outfit representing some twisted version of classy. I felt an unsettling heaviness in my chest, and I excused myself to the kitchen for a moment of sanity, hoping a few deep breaths could drown out the noise. I poured myself a glass of water, feeling the cold glass against my sweaty palm when suddenly Clara appeared at the door, leaning against the frame with that same mocking grin. "Aren't you tired of pretending to be the perfect fiancé? Or does he not mind that you're really just a little weirdo?" she said, taking a deliberate step closer as if to intimidate me. Panic bubbled within me, and all the moments I had held back came flooding to the surface. I blurted out that she was unwelcome in our home. Silence. The kitchen, once filled with the scent of garlic and roasted chicken, turned so still it felt like I had yanked out the air from the room. Time slowed as her expression shifted, eyes narrowing, lips curling into a smirk tinged with malice. "You really think a little boundary will save you? This is not just your house, this is our family, dear," she hissed, emphasizing the word "our" with venom that sent chills down my spine. It was at that moment, watching her intense gaze penetrate through my facade, that I realized I had inadvertently wedged myself deep into a battle I was bound to lose. The wall between us felt insurmountable, and when I finally emerged from that kitchen, it was to a scene that felt surreal. Tom caught in a web of confusion and frustration as Clara spilled the beans about our little confrontation. The smiles turned into whispers as a funeral-like hush descended over our guests. I could see some looking at me in pity, others stunned, and the dagger of humiliation plunged deeper into my already frayed nerves. It felt like I was standing on a precipice, the ground trembling beneath me, and in a split second of sheer panic, I realized I was not the only one threatened by this shattering tension. Tom's eyes flashed with anger, disappointment, and betrayal, and before I could explain, I felt the cold weight of the room's judgment tighten around my throat. He turned to me, voice low and trembling. "Why would you do that? Why would you make a scene?" It struck me like a slap in the face, heartbreaking because this wasn't about me being the focus of the drama. I had only been trying to set the stage for a peaceful beginning, so why couldn't he see that? Determined to resolve the chaos, I tried justifying my feelings, asserting my need for boundaries, but all I got in return was the flicker of anger in his eyes, a refusal to understand. Clara was still smirking, her victory evident as she leaned back against the wall, arms crossed, soaking in every moment of my humiliation. I felt as if I was the intruder in my own life, torn between my love for Tom and the need for self-respect, my very existence reduced to a battle over territory, and I finally spoke the truth, that I wasn't comfortable with Clara slipping in and out of our lives like she was a part of the furniture, and that anger transformed into terrible isolation as Tom stepped back, shaking his head, whispering that I didn't know how to play nice with family, that I would always be an outsider to his world. The words pierced deeper than anything Clara could have said. I stood there, wrestling with waves of despair, realizing the nightmare was not just her presence but the fact that I was losing him. It felt surreal in the aftermath as people hovered awkwardly, unsure whether to support me or defend him, the tension strangling the air, collapsing my hopes of love into ashes. I tried to refuse Clara's smug smile, but the reality sunk in like the darkness gathering around me. This was never going to end well, and as the night dragged on, I watched Tom grow more frustrated, more distant, and I realized that in trying to stand my ground, I had unwittingly dug a grave for our relationship, slowly trapped in a dissonance that had settled over both our lives, one that made me question if I was the villain or merely a puppet pulled by strings of a vengeful fate. Now the boundaries blurred, and all I could wish for was to rewind. Instead, I found myself waking up in our new home alone the next morning, losing sight of the dreams I once had, staring at the walls which felt less like comfort and more like a cage filled with memories of regret, uncertain whether Tom would choose to fight for us or slide into the shadows, where Clara lurked, waiting to further her twisted campaign against the fragile remnants of what remained of our love. It was just supposed to be a casual night in with my friends, sitting on the couch while we binge-watched old horror movies and made jokes about the cheesy effects, but everything shifted when Lynn, my closest friend, leaned in with a mischievous grin and said, "You know, watching you two is like watching a really intricate roleplay," and for a split second, I started laughing, not because I thought it was true, who would seriously think that? But more because the idea struck me as absurd, like something ripped from the pages of a bad fanfiction. My boyfriend, Jake, chuckled too, more out of awkwardness than agreement, but when I looked at Lynn, her expression changed from playful to something darker, almost predator-like, and in that moment, I felt a chill skitter down my spine. I shrugged it off, dismissing it as one of her quirky comments at first, but the laughter died in the air, replaced by a heavy silence. I didn't realize it then, but my laugh had unearthed something buried deep within the group, like invoking a slumbering spirit at a seance. The night progressed, filled with laughter over bad jump scares and popcorn fights, but every so often, I'd catch Lynn staring at me through the flickering light of the TV, her gaze intense, almost conspiratorial. As the clock struck midnight, the final film ended, leaving echoes of creepy music lingering in the air, and we all decided to call it a night. I started cleaning up the mess, tossing empty snack bags into the trash while Jake and Lynn chatted in the corner, and I could tell something was off. Lynn's smile had morphed into a smirk, and I felt that familiar unease prick at my skin, a sense I couldn't quite shake. Later, as Jake and I were getting ready for bed, I joked about Lynn's comment, playfully nudging him, maybe we should, spice things up a bit? But he didn't laugh. Instead, he frowned, his brow furrowing. What did you mean by that? He asked, and I felt a rush of confusion. Wasn't we on the same page? I told him I was kidding, but then he shifted closer, scanning my face. You didn't take her seriously, did you? The weight of his gaze pierced through me, and a strange dread curled in the pit of my stomach as I denied it, even as I recalled the glint in Lynn's eyes. The next day, Lynn's texts were as animated as always, but beneath the surface, I could sense something off, like frayed wires on a live circuit. When I met up with her later, I tried to broach the subject lightly, but she dismissed my concern, her laughter ringing too loud, too haunting. The following months became a looping nightmare, where I'd catch Lynn watching me with an intensity that made my heart race, each encounter steeped in an unsettling tension I couldn't comprehend. I'd hear whispers behind my back, hushed tones between Jake and Lynn whenever I left the room, and Jake had begun to change too, his jovial demeanor shadowed by an underlying paranoia that echoed my own. Our intimate conversations grew strained, and he started to echo my own worries back at me. Was Lynn really just a friend, or had I become a pawn in their twisted game? The realization that Lynn had crossed a boundary I didn't fully grasp gripped me like a vice, and unease morphed into outright dread as I pieced together that her ramblings about roleplay might not have been innocent at all. One fateful night, driven by a mix of fear and determination, I decided I had to confront Lynn. I needed to know what was going on behind her mask of friendship. I invited her over, pretending to keep the atmosphere light, yet when she arrived, I could feel the storm brewing beneath our pleasantries, her laughter shrill and forced as I coiled my fists against my trembling legs. What did you really mean when you said we were role-playing? I pressed, and her expression flipped from playful to predatory, the corners of her mouth curling into that tight-lipped smile I'd come to dread. Oh honey, she said, her voice sickly sweet, you're the one playing a part, but the script was never given to you. You're just too naive to see it. My heart raced as I felt the air grow thick with something so palpable, it bordered on tangible. Every warning bell I had ignored screamed in my head, and I tried to excuse myself, to reclaim my sanity, but as I turned to the door, I could hear her murmuring my name, each syllable laced with something darker. The following week twisted into a surreal nightmare. I started to see shadows cast from my past interactions with both women seep through the cracks of my whitewashed reality, memories warped and rewritten. I catch Jake staring blanks at his phone, brow furrowed, whispers weaving like spider silk between Lynn's oddly timed texts and his own responses, and the intimacy we had shared dwindled to cold, vacant exchanges. I tried talking to him about it, about how Lynn was siphoning energy between us like we were puppets strung along by her whims, but each time, he'd grow defensive, lashing out as if my concerns were unfounded, and I found myself backed into a corner, racked with doubt, as if I was losing both my boyfriend and my own sense of reality. On a particularly agonizing night, exhaustion overtook me, and I collapsed into a restless sleep, plagued by eerie dreams where I was an actor trapped in a puppet show, a caged bird pecked at by invisible threads pulling me into darker depths. I awoke with a start, and for a fleeting moment, the haze of the dream lingered, and I felt compelled to check my messages. The screen glowed eerie in the dark, and as I scrolled through the texts, dread coiled like a serpent around my heart when I discovered an unexpected text from Jake, "Meet me at the old playground," and the timestamp sent a shiver down my spine. It was sent during the night while I'd been dreaming. My heart pounded in my chest as questions overwhelmed me. Had they been plotting against me? What role had I been cast in? I grabbed my keys, driven by An impulse that propelled me forward, the shadows closing in like a muffled silence. The playground loomed in the distance, cloaked in darkness, and each step felt heavy, weighed down by foreboding whispers. As I arrived, the air turned thick and clammy, veiled in a chilling mist that whispered my name. "Jake." I called, but the night swallowed my voice whole. I turned, searching every silhouette under the moonlight, and then I saw her, Lynn, standing there, and in a heartbeat, I froze, terror gripping my throat as I felt an icy blast of realization. It wasn't Jake waiting for me, it was her, and the glint in her eyes confirmed the role I had unknowingly stepped into was far from innocent. "You finally made it," she said, her voice a twisted serenade that shattered my resolve. "I've been waiting for you." The darkness enveloped me, and I was left suspended in a nightmarish tableau, understanding too late that the laughter I once shared had been merely the haunting echo of a sinister game I never wished to play. A few weeks ago, I found myself embroiled in a family feud that spiraled so quickly into something inexplicable, it still sends shivers down my spine. My cousin Amelia, who is a year younger than me, had a tendency toward excessive socializing, practically inviting half of our high school to any gathering we had, regardless of the time or place. But this year, Thanksgiving was at my parents' house, and after nearly 2 decades of noisy celebrations filled with the smell of turkey and pumpkin pie, I had my fill of her friends slumped on our couches or rummaging through the fridge, oblivious to any boundaries. So, when she announced excitedly that she was planning to invite her entire friend group over for Thanksgiving, I snapped. I told her she couldn't do that. "Amelia, this isn't a party, it's Thanksgiving," I said, my voice a mix of irritation and concern. With tears threatening to spill, she stormed off, muttering something under her breath, and I thought little of it at the time. Yet soon after, the atmosphere around the house shifted, as if a thick fog had rolled in uninvited. I dismissed it as the usual family tension, until the day before Thanksgiving, when everything escalated dramatically. That evening, I was alone in my room, scrolling through social media when I heard an unsettling sound, like the distant echoes of laughter and mingling voices, muffled by the walls. At first, I thought it was just Amelia, and maybe her friends had come over anyway. So I crept down the hallway, pausing at the top of the stairs, when suddenly, everything went silent, replaced by the haunting clang of silverware dropping to the floor. I think it's worth noting that it was almost midnight, yet the dining room lights flickered as if someone were playing tricks with the switch. Out of curiosity and more than a little fear, I tiptoed down, half expecting to find my family enjoying some last-minute preparations. To my utter confusion, the dining table was set for an extravagant meal, plates stacked, candles burning, but no one was there. A chill crept up my spine, and I suddenly felt like an intruder in my own home. I felt compelled to call out, "Hello?" But the words barely left my lips when I saw the centerpiece, a grotesque arrangement of wilted flowers, and beneath them lay a note in Amelia's unmistakable handwriting: "You shouldn't have done that." I froze, heart pounding, convinced it was some cruel prank. I backed away slowly, intending to bolt upstairs, but as I turned, I caught sight of something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow flitted past, quick and darting like a live thing. My instincts screamed for me to run, but I found myself paralyzed. It felt as if I were awaiting something profound. When I finally gathered the courage to rush back to my room, I slammed the door and locked it tight, hoping that would be enough to keep whatever I'd just witnessed at bay. That night, I hardly slept, plagued by uneasy thoughts filled with what festered between Amelia and me. The morning of Thanksgiving dawned gray and heavy, the air thick with an odd sense of dread I couldn't shake. As my family began to arrive, I tried to put on a brave face, forcing myself to engage in the usual small talk. Every now and then, I would glance toward the front door, half expecting a bustling group of Amelia's friends to barge in, but they never did. A creeping confusion and guilt gnawed at me as I remembered Amelia's tear-streaked face, that feeling of something undisclosed shared in those fleeting moments before she left. But when the dinner bell rang and we settled at the table, there was an emptiness around us that felt wrong. I hadn't noticed it before, but Amelia's absence cast a shadow over everything. Her seat lay conspicuously empty, and as the food was served, a hush fell over my family, like we were missing someone vital. I tried to swallow my unease, laughing at my uncle's jokes while the rest picked through their food absent-mindedly, eyes darting toward the door as if expecting Amelia to walk in with a smile and an entourage. But she didn't arrive. During a quiet moment, I ventured the question everyone seemed hesitant to voice: "Where's Amelia?" My mom stiffened, and the air soured. She cancelled last minute, my dad muttered, eyeing me as if I were the cause of this mischief. A suffocating silence followed, and just as I thought the tension might snap, my younger brother piped up, "Hey, isn't that her car?" Our gaze turned toward the window, where the faint, unmistakable outline of Amelia's old Honda sat in the fading twilight. But Amelia didn't emerge from the vehicle, nor did anyone else. I felt a pang of worry shoot through me as I realized besides that strange note, I hadn't spoken with her since our argument. Just as I was about to suggest we check on her, a sudden shudder rattled the house, and the lights flickered ominously. For a heartbeat, everything went pitch black, and I could hear the muffled panic inside the house, my family's voices blending into a chaotic symphony of fear. When the lights returned with an angry flicker, our eyes found the windows, which revealed a reflection I'll never forget. There, pressed to the glass, was Amelia, her eyes wide and frantic, mouth moving as if she were screaming. But the sound. It didn't reach us. In that horrific moment, I felt something wrench inside my chest, a sense of cold accusation settling firmly in my gut. I didn't know what I'd unleashed by saying Amelia couldn't invite her friends. I lunged for the door, my heart pounding, but before I could escape, the house became agonizingly still. Drawing in a breath, unsure whether to feel more terror or dread, I realized something was terribly wrong, as if an uninvited guest had slipped silently into our home, something that lurked and stared from the corners of our lives. Thanksgiving dinner turned into a nightmare, family gathered around shivering in silence, while outside, the world was hushed, and the only sound was the echo of Amelia's voiceless scream. I never went outside that night, I was too scared, paralyzed by the unknown lurking just beyond the door. The next morning, without any explanation, they found Amelia's car empty and her gone, no trace of her anywhere. The police didn't find a single clue. As days blurred into weeks, no one ever spoke of her disappearance, and when I finally gathered the courage to ask my mother about her, all she would say was, "You shouldn't have asked her not to invite her friends." When Thanksgiving came around again a year later, the dread returned, settling on my shoulders like a curse. Amelia was gone, and I couldn't shake the feeling that somehow, it was all my fault. Even now, as the holidays draw near, I can't look at the empty chair where she used to sit at the table without feeling an icy sensation clawing at my insides. You might think it's just the guilt, but deep down, I know it's more than that. Those shadows cast by our family dinners have grown darker, something unseen digs into my gut, festering with secrets. And even today, I still hear her laughter echo through the walls, diluted yet almost tangible, taunting me like a warning of what happens when you tell someone they can't invite their friends for Thanksgiving. I never thought I would reach the point where I had to cut my sister out of our weekly family dinners, but the moment she showed up with her son, Ethan, wearing a shirt that read "I don't care" and a scowl that could melt ice, I knew this was going to be different. Each week it had turned into a circus act, with Ethan running wild, climbing on furniture, and hollering about how everyone else was boring, while my sister, Lisa, just sat there scrolling through her phone, occasionally muttering half-hearted attempts to curb his antics. My parents would smile awkwardly, trying to ignore the chaos while I gritted my teeth, feeling every tentative attempt to make a meal or share a moment together slipping away like grains of sand. On one particularly disastrous evening, Ethan managed to grab a handful of mashed potatoes and fling them across the table, where they landed squarely in my dad's lap. Instead of mortification or an apology, Lisa just laughed it off, throwing her head back like this mess was some kind of comedy show. I snapped. "He needs boundaries, Lisa. You can't just let him act however he likes." Her laughter immediately turned into a glare as she shot back, "Really? Is that how you treat your kids? With such high expectations?" The accusation struck deep. I could feel my heart rate quicken, each beat echoing my growing frustration. So, after that night, or should I say debacle, I made a decision. I would stop inviting her until she could either parent her son or keep her opinions about how I raise my kids to herself. At first, it felt empowering, a way to reclaim my sanity, but then she began to retaliate, posting veiled messages on social media about the burden of judgment and family forgiveness. I felt a twinge of guilt each time I saw those whispers online, but my resolve was firm, like a wall against the tidal wave of her emotional blackmail. Weeks turned into months, and I convinced myself that I was the adult in the room, enforcing a boundary that had desperately needed reinforcing. But the longer I kept her at bay, the more I could feel something dark unraveling, like an uninvited guest finally revealing their true nature. I would wake up panicking some nights after dreaming of Ethan, screaming in a distorted version of my face, his laughter turning hollow as if he was mocking me for trying to carve out my sanctity. Then, one day, a message popped up on my phone. It was Lisa, a simple plea, "Can we talk? I miss you." I was caught off guard, my heart cautiously optimistic. Maybe she understood. Maybe this time would be different. I agreed to meet her at a coffee shop, the space buzzing with life, but the air between us felt suffocatingly thick. As she fidgeted with her cup, I braced myself, ready to hear her new understanding of parenthood or, at the very least, some acknowledgement of our strained relationship. Instead, she exploded, "You think you're better than me because you get to dictate who I can bring around? Ethan is my son, and he'll be how he wants to be, just like I will." I was taken aback by her intensity, like staring into a storm brewing on the horizon. My mind raced, thoughts tangled up as I fought the urge to defend myself. "I'm not better, Lisa. I'm just trying to make sure our family dinners don't feel like a war zone. I need you to step up." Instead of a resolution, we only escalated, voices raised until people were glancing over, expressions of concern flickering across their faces. In that moment, it was like the earth beneath me split open, revealing something dark and twisted, years of resentment, envy, and a complete misunderstanding of what family meant. The coffee shop felt stifling, too warm, too bright, and when she abruptly stood, throwing her half-empty cup on the table and storming out, I felt like I had broken something precious and irreversible. Days turned into weeks, and the silence hung heavily in the air, permeating my every thought until even my kids began to notice my despondence. One night, while tucking my son into bed, I overheard them whispering about how Aunt Lisa didn't love us anymore. Their innocent whispers pricked me, forcing me to face the nature of my estrangement. It was a pattern, a wound we were both festering that seemed impossible to stitch back together. The turning point came in the form of a phone call. It was my mother on the other end, sounding distraught. "It's Lisa. She's not doing well," she breathed heavily. I felt my stomach churn, a deep pit forming as I heard the cracks of her voice. It turned out Ethan had been caught stealing from a store, and in a fit of despair, he had lashed out at his mom, claiming that she never cared. The lines continued to blur, the good, the bad, my choices, her choices, and the children caught in the crossfire. Later that same day, I stood outside their apartment, the familiar knocking on the door filled with a weight I wasn't sure I could lift. When Lisa finally opened up, her eyes were red, and her cheeks streaked with tears. I expected anger or confusion, perhaps even a breath of pride in her parenting. Instead, she crumpled at the sight of me, relentless anguish welling up in her gaze as she fell into my arms. "I'm failing, and I don't know how to fix this." Those words hung heavy in the air, laced in heartbreak and desperation. In that moment, I realized that we weren't just fighting over dinner invitations, we were wrestling with our fears and insecurities as parents. And as I held her, my heart began to soften. We began a long conversation that felt like a true reckoning. Those dinners we had both associated with chaos transformed into a healing ground, a space for vulnerability and support rather than the judgment we had projected onto one another. It took time, but soon enough, laughter replaced the tension, and while Ethan's antics didn't disappear entirely, resilience threaded its way back into our family fabric. I learned that sometimes, letting go of boundaries doesn't mean accepting chaos but inviting each other to grow and learn within that chaos, and maybe, just maybe, love would find its way back to our table one meal at a time.